Robert Baratheon's breath came in ragged, painful rasps as he staggered through the damp undergrowth. Moonlight broke through the canopy of leaves in pale silver shards, illuminating the fresh blood staining his hunting leathers. Ser Barristan Selmy moved swiftly at his side, one gauntlet hand under the king's arm to steady him. The boar's thrashing had subsided at last, the monstrous creature lying still where it had collapsed among the broken bracken. But Robert's own wound gushed. He should never have drunk so heavily. He should have listened to the warning in Ned Stark's eyes before draining yet another skin of wine. But these were thoughts that came too late, echoing through his mind as the king's knees threatened to buckle. Pride had always been Robert's downfall, but he refused to fall now. He would not give the stranger the satisfaction. They managed to haul him toward the camp, where the great torches burned and the rest of his hunting party waited anxiously. Men rushed to help, their voices a tumultuous roar in Robert's ringing ears. Someone pulled back the rent leather covering his side, exposing the vicious tear the boar's tusk had left. There were gasps of horror, and for a moment, Robert thought he glimpsed the gaunt face of death itself. It was there, hovering at the edge of his consciousness, beckoning. Then another voice cut through the din. "Move aside," barked a man's voice. "Let me see it." It was Maester Pycelle, puffing and hurrying, his chain rattling in the darkness. Wrinkled hands reached for Robert, pressed ointments and cloths against his wound to stanch the bleeding. The pain was staggering. Robert grunted, then roared in frustration. He wanted to rise, to shout, to fight. The ground suddenly seemed to tilt beneath him, but Selmy's arm kept him upright. The next several moments blurred together. They half led, half carried him toward his royal tent, where the maester's table was spread with bandages and potions. Robert sat heavily, trying to gather his strength, scowling at any who dared to suggest that his wound might be mortal. When the first wave of agony subsided, he forced himself to speak. Where's Stark?" he demanded, jaw set, eyes grim. "Get him here." Lord Eddard Stark, newly named Hand of the King, stepped inside the tent only moments later, the flickering torchlight catching in his gray eyes. He looked more tired than usual, lines of worry etched into his brow as he took in the sight of Robert. The king sat slumped, bloodied, trying to mask his weakness behind a sneer. But Ned could see past the bravado. He had always seen past Robert's jests and anger to the man beneath, the man who had led them to victory against the Targaryens, who had once loved Lyanna Stark beyond all measure. "Why in the seven hells do you look so grim, Ned?" Robert croaked. "A scratch, that's all." Ned grimaced and cast a glance at Maester Pycelle, who knelt at Robert's side, rummaging among his potions. "Your Grace," Pycelle said, voice trembling with the weight of the moment. "The wound is deep, and there's poison in it." "Poison," Robert repeated, his face blazed with anger. "Don't jest with me." Pycelle shook his head. "It is no jest. Some vile substance laced upon the boar's tusks, perhaps." The creature's mouth stank of acrid residue, an unusual smell. "The fever has set in swiftly." Barristan Selmy's face twisted with concern, but Robert saw the flicker of something else in the old knight's eyes. Guilt, perhaps. Who had let him drink too much? Who had handed him that strong wine, again and again, ignoring the hazards of the hunt? Robert's thoughts seized on a suspicion. The Lannisters, Cersei, they were always plotting in the dark corners of the Red Keep. Could it be that his own queen had orchestrated this? He blinked away the dizziness that threatened to swallow him and pulled Ned close. "Swear to me," Robert rasped, spittle flying from his lips. "Swear to me you'll take care of Joff. You'll. Ned's eyes narrowed, uncertain. "Robert." The king coughed, spat blood into the dirt, then twisted his mouth into a grimace that might have been a grin if not for the pain that contorted his features. "There's something foul here, Ned," he whispered. "Cersei. She wants the throne for her cub. But if that's not truly my cub." Ned started to speak, but Robert silenced him with a hand, the powerful grip of a warrior who refused to let go of life. The king's voice, though hoarse, was firm. "Pycelle, do what you must. I will not die from a pig's tusk. I'm the Stormlord, damn you. You treat me like a child. I'll have your head." Pycelle fluttered nervously. "Your Grace, I shall do all I can." Robert drank the antidotes Pycelle forced on him. He seethed under the needlework, refusing the sweet sleep of milk of the poppy. Through the night he fought the fever that raged in his blood. At times, his ravings were so loud the whole camp stirred. But Ned and Baratheon remained by his side, lending quiet reassurance. A cold sweat drenched Robert's body, and agony seemed to lurk behind his every breath, but he did not let go. By dawn, the fever broke, slowly, painfully. Pycelle dared to hope the poison had not taken mortal hold. When Robert opened his eyes to the milky light of day, he realized he was still alive. His strength had fled him, but the rage in his heart had only grown. He felt as if he had faced down death itself and spat in its face. He might have died from that wound, he should have, if the gods were cruel. But the gods, it seemed, had not yet finished with him. Pain marred every movement as he pushed himself upright, ignoring Pycelle's tremulous protests. Ned, who had not left his side all night, stood solemnly. Baratheon offered a stiff salute. "I won't lie here in the muck," Robert muttered. "Help me to my feet." "Your Grace," Ned began, voice laden with concern. "You need rest. I need to show the realm that I still live, that I am still Robert Baratheon. I'll not have rumors swirling in King's Landing that the Boar did me in." He forced a grin, though each breath hurt. "Come on. If I can stand, I can ride." He did stand, with the help of Ned and Selmy. It was a staggering moment, but his pride refused to let him keel over. He locked his knees until the world stopped spinning. He allowed them to dress him in a fresh tunic, pulling it gingerly over the bandages that swathed his side. Every moment was a jolt of pain, but with that pain came the embers of fury. He thought of Cersei, of her closeness with her twin, Jaime. He thought of Joffrey's golden hair, so unlike the black locks of House Baratheon. He remembered the anxious look on Pycelle's face when he mentioned poison, and in that swirl of half-delirious anger, Robert Baratheon made a vow. He would uncover the truth of this, no matter how many heads would roll. By the time they broke camp, Robert had forced his body to obey him. He could ride, though he leaned heavily on the pommel of his saddle at first. King or not, he was still a warrior of the old days, a proven soldier from the rebellion. He would endure. The sun climbed higher, dust motes shimmering in the warm light that filtered through the trees. The boar's great carcass had been left for scavengers, a testament to the savage cunning that had nearly claimed the king's life. On the long ride back to King's Landing, Robert hardly spoke. Now and again, Ned tried to ask gentle questions. Had Robert truly suspected poison? Was there proof? Robert only shook his head, jaw clenched, sweat beading at his temples. Proof would come. He suspected many things, but until he could prove them, he would keep silent. He needed a clear mind to think. Somewhere in the swirling remnants of fever, in the memory of that monstrous boar's tusks, lay the knowledge that he had nearly died. That changed a man. He felt a new resolution within, a sense of being reborn into a more dangerous realm. The throne was not secure. He had been a fool to let the Lannisters hold such power. He would be a fool no more. When their party arrived at the Red Keep, the gates swung wide. Courtiers waited with expressions of dread, expecting news of the king's death. As they saw Robert upright, they murmured in astonishment. But Robert was in no mood for flattery or relief. He dismounted with difficulty, ignoring the waves of pain. The courtyard fell silent. Cersei stood at the top of the steps leading inside, her golden hair bright in the midday sun, Joffrey at her side. The boy looked startled, glancing at his father's ashen face and the stained bandages beneath his tunic. "My lord husband," Cersei said, voice poised. "We heard such dreadful news. I was inside," Robert barked. His voice carried across the yard, making the attendants shrink away. "All of you inside." No one dared disobey. Cersei's green eyes flashed with a flicker of anger, but she kept her composure. She led Joffrey inside, followed by the rest of the royal entourage. Robert directed Barristan Selmy to seize control of the throne room's entrances and allow no one to leave without his permission. The gold cloaks seemed uncertain, but they obeyed with slow, puzzled nods. Inside the throne room, the Iron Throne loomed like a monstrous, spiked beast. Robert stood before it, sweat darkening his hair at the temples. One hand pressed protectively to his bandaged flank. Cersei tried to approach, but he stayed her with a glare. "You will speak only when spoken to," he growled. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and stepped back. The lords and ladies that had gathered for the king's return sensed the storm building in the king's eyes. A hush fell. Joffrey looked from his mother to his father, confusion etched on his features. Robert's stare swept the room until it came to rest on Varys, the master of whisperers, standing in a discreet corner. Pycelle was there, and Littlefinger too, though he stood half behind a pillar as though uncertain of the mood. The hush was suffocating. "I nearly died," Robert said, and the words echoed. "The boar gored me, and there was poison upon its tusks." His gaze flicked to Cersei and then to Pycelle. "Is that something you've heard of before, Maester?" Pycelle swallowed, his jowls trembling. "Your Grace, it is not unheard of. Some huntsmen steep boars' tusks in poisons, though it is a cruel practice. Certainly not anything condoned in the Seven Kingdoms." "Aye, enough," Robert interrupted, voice reverberating off the marble floors. "I want no excuses. The question is who was behind it, or was it mere chance? A vile act by the gods themselves." He stepped forward, turning his searing gaze upon his queen. "I have questions for you, Cersei, but they will wait." He turned next to Varys. "You, spider, you have ears in every wall. Did you know of any plot to do me harm on this hunt?" Varys bowed, all fluttering silks and measured humility. "My little birds have whispered many things, Your Grace, but none spoke of such a cowardly plan. Had I known, I would have fluttered to your side immediately. I live only to serve you and the realm." Lips twisted, Robert exhaled. He believed Varys only as far as he had to. The eunuch was slippery, always concealing half the truth. "We'll see," Robert growled. "We'll see." He dismissed the court abruptly, leaving them in anxious disarray. Only Ned Stark remained at Robert's nod, while the Lannisters and their retinue withdrew under the watchful eyes of Ser Barristan's guards. Cersei cast a long, unreadable look at Robert before she turned to go. Joffrey, frowning, shuffled out behind her. Robert stood there, the tension in his shoulders evident, as the last echoes of footsteps died away. Then, with a groan, he sagged against Ned's shoulder, pain contorting his features. Ned supported him gently, calling for a page to bring water and a chair. Robert wanted to object. He was king, damn it, and strong enough to stand, but the wound still burned. Finally, he allowed himself a seat, turning to Ned with weary eyes. "It's worse than you thought," Ned murmured. Robert let out a hollow laugh. "I always knew my court was a pit of snakes, but to try and kill me on a hunt? If it was indeed that and not some random misfortune." Ned sighed. "I have suspicions, but Robert, you must be certain. If you move too swiftly without proof, I've had enough of waiting. Waiting is what nearly got me killed." Robert's voice trembled with outrage. "I feel in my bones that this was no mere accident, and even if it was, I can use it. I'm done letting the Lannisters nest in my hall and scratch at my throne. They think I'm a drunken fool, so drunk that a pig can kill me. I'll show them otherwise." Ned was silent, though Robert saw the worry in his eyes. He was always the cautious one, that Ned Stark. But Robert had no interest in caution. He had marched to victory with his warhammer in hand, heart ablaze with wrath. That was how he had won the throne in the first place. Now, in his middle years, had he grown too complacent? He thought of Cersei's smug smiles, of Tywin Lannister's golden mane and calculating stare. The Lannisters had grown bolder every year. Robert resolved to crush their ambitions, to rip them up root and stem if they had truly dared to move against him. In the days that followed, the Red Keep bristled with tension. Robert, still recovering from the wound, refused to remain bedridden. He hobbled about, leaning on a heavy cane when his side pained him too greatly. Courtiers gawked at the sight of the king in such a state, but Robert did not care. He would not appear weak. Cersei hovered near him, attempting to exercise her usual manipulations, but Robert kept her at arm's length. He demanded she remain mostly confined to her chambers until he was prepared to summon her. She raged at him in private, of course, but he would not relent. She was queen in name only now, and he wanted the court to see who truly held the reins of power. Once or twice, Joffrey approached him in the corridors, the boy's face pinched and uncertain. Robert forced himself not to snarl. A memory flickered in his mind. Joffrey's fair hair and delicate features, so unlike his own. The black-haired Baratheon line was strong. Stannis had black hair. Renly had black hair. All of Robert's bastards bore that same dark brand. But Joffrey was golden as a lion cub. If the rumors were true, if what Ned suspected were true, then Joffrey was no son of Robert Baratheon. The king's heart clenched around that bitter possibility, for it would mean his marriage to Cersei had been the emptiest of farces. Yet that might also be the final push he needed to be rid of her. He needed more evidence, though. If he simply denounced Cersei's children, the realm would splinter, and Tywin Lannister would declare war. The realm was not ready for another savage conflict, nor was Robert, truth be told. But perhaps the realm would have to endure it, if the alternative was a nest of usurpers feasting at court. One morning, Robert summoned Ned to a private solar and bid him speak freely. "I asked you before about the boy," Robert muttered, pacing. "You had concerns." Ned's face was somber. "I do. The Book of Lineages for the Great Houses states that every Baratheon child is dark of hair, from the earliest days of your bloodline's history. I also recall a certain line from the House Lannister. They have always prized their golden locks." "Aye. So you suspect the boy is Jaime's get?" Robert snapped, finishing the unspoken statement. "I'd heard this rumor, the talk of twin incest. Disgusting. I ignored it, though. Didn't want to see it. By the gods, if it's true." He trailed off, fists trembling at his sides. The rage threatened to consume him, until the pain in his ribs flared, tempering his fury with cold reality. He had to be smart. Not for the first time, he wished he were as clever as Tywin or as cunning as Varys. Instead, he was Robert, the warrior king, and he would proceed in the way he knew best: direct confrontation. "Bring me my brother Stannis," Robert declared. "I trust him more than I trust Renly. Have him come to King's Landing at once. Summon him to the small council. If the realm is to erupt in war, I'll want my most loyal men at my side. And see that Tywin Lannister is told to come as well. He's still the Warden of the West, and I want to see his eyes when these accusations fall." Ned bowed. "As you wish, but be wary, Robert. Tywin is not a man to be cornered lightly." Robert spat. "Nor am I." The next fortnight passed in a slow, seething haze. Robert's side healed slowly, thanks in part to Pycelle's daily ministrations. Whisperings abounded through the keep, that the king had changed, that he now roamed the halls like a prowling beast, that he was hunting traitors in his midst. Robert let the rumors swirl. Fear would keep the petty lords in line. Cersei did not come willingly to him in this time, nor did Robert bid her come. She sulked in her chambers or spent time with her children, occasionally sending out lords loyal to House Lannister to probe the king's intentions. Robert dismissed them all. Once or twice, he overheard the whispers that Jaime Lannister had visited her in the night, though the Kingslayer had otherwise remained distant, claiming duties with the Kingsguard. Robert suspected they were planning a united front, forging a stance against him for the day he revealed his hand. Meanwhile, Varys brought small scraps of information each day, all couched in riddles. He whispered of ships seen near Casterly Rock, of gold being moved from Lannisport. Each sign pointed to the Lannisters preparing for possible conflict. Robert felt the tension coil within his chest. Good, he thought. Let them sense the threat. Let them gather their strength. It would make their downfall all the sweeter when he struck. Finally, Stannis arrived. The Lord of Dragonstone was as stern and humorless as ever. His dark hair graying at the temples, jaw set in a perpetual frown. He greeted Robert with a stiff bow. The king embraced him, ignoring the flash of discomfort in his brother's eyes. "It's good to see you upright," Stannis said bluntly. "I had heard you were near death." Robert smirked. "Near but not done. The gods will have to try harder if they want me." They spoke in the privacy of Robert's solar, Ned present as well, but no one else. Robert told Stannis everything, from his suspicion of Lannister treachery to the rumors of Joffrey's parentage. Stannis listened intently, his face as grim as if he were chiseled from stone. "If the boy is not yours, then he has no right to the throne," Stannis said at last, voice low and clipped. "The line of succession would naturally pass to me upon your death, or to you if you remain alive and wish to name an heir. But removing an heir once recognized by the realm is no small matter. Tywin will not stand idle while you disinherit his daughter's children. The realm could plunge into war." Robert clenched his jaw. "Better war than a bastard sitting on the Iron Throne. Did I fight Aerys and Rhaegar Targaryen only to hand the crown to the offspring of incest?" Stannis inclined his head. "Then let us gather absolute proof. Once we show the realm that Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen are born of Jaime Lannister, no decent lord would side with Cersei. They'd see it as an affront to the gods themselves." Ned nodded. "Proof can be found in the lineages and by comparing the traits of Robert's many bastards. Gendry." At that, Robert barked a bitter laugh. "Oh yes, the boy Gendry. He's got my hair, my look. He's more a Baratheon than Joffrey ever was. Damnable irony, that my bastard might wear my face more truly than my so-called trueborn son." They drew up a plan to reveal the truth to the council at a carefully chosen moment, with lords from across the realm present. That moment came soon enough, for Tywin Lannister arrived in King's Landing in a blaze of gold and crimson. He rode at the head of a contingent of mounted knights, their polished armor reflecting the midday sun. Word of his arrival spread swiftly, and tension soared. Robert gathered the small council, minus Littlefinger, whom he considered too slippery. But Varys, Pycelle, and Renly were in attendance, along with Ned and Stannis. Tywin walked in, flanked by Tyrion and a retinue of Lannister bannermen. Cersei and Jaime were absent, which was curious, but Robert did not comment on it yet. The doors of the council chamber slammed shut behind Tywin, leaving them all in a hush. Robert sat at the head of the table, trying not to grimace as the pang in his side flared. Tywin inclined his head stiffly in greeting. "Your Grace, I came as summoned," Tywin said, voice cool. "May I ask why the urgent call?" Robert eyed him for a moment, measuring him. The Lord of Casterly Rock exuded an impenetrable aura of confidence and cunning. Robert had always found the man cold, but formidable. He could not afford to show any sign of weakness before him. "You may, Lord Tywin," Robert said at last, his voice echoing in the chamber. "I have survived an attempt on my life, I believe. You must have heard." Tywin's green eyes flickered. "I heard that you were wounded by a boar in the Kingswood. I'm pleased you recovered." "A boar with poisoned tusks?" Robert shot back, studying Tywin's face for any reaction. "Do you know anything about that?" Tywin did not flinch. "I do not. If I did, I would have told you." Robert's gaze slid to Tyrion, who wore a neutral expression. Then to Pycelle, who avoided his eyes by staring at his folded hands. Silence stretched, taut as a drawn bowstring. "Your daughter has been less than a dutiful wife," Robert said, letting the words drop like stones. "I have reason to believe that Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen are not of my blood. A lesser man would have sputtered, roared, or betrayed some sign of shock. Tywin was not a lesser man. His face remained like stone, though a faint muscle twitched near his jaw. "That is a grave accusation," he said at length. "I trust you have proof." Robert nodded to Ned, who produced a heavy tome and set it on the table, the lineages and histories of the great houses of the Seven Kingdoms. Ned spoke quietly, explaining the distinct hereditary traits of House Baratheon, the black hair that had been passed down through centuries. Then Stannis added a few words about the bastards Robert had fathered, each bearing that same dark coloring, all of them scattered across the realm. Finally, Ned laid bare the suspicion that Jaime Lannister had sired Cersei's children. Throughout the explanation, Tywin said nothing. His face did not change, yet in his eyes flickered a fury so deep it rivaled Robert's. When Ned finished, the hush that followed was almost painful. Even Varys seemed at a loss for words. "So," Robert growled, "have you nothing to say, Tywin?" Tywin drew a measured breath. "I say that your allegations are monstrous. Cersei would not dare commit such treason." "Treason it is," Stannis said flatly. "We have cause to place her under arrest." A brief flash of Tywin's anger showed. "On what grounds? Her alleged adultery with her brother, based on hair color? This is a serious matter. The realm will not simply accept these claims because you speak them." "Then let the realm see the proof," Robert snapped. "They can compare the children's features with the Baratheon line. They can ask your son, Jaime, how close he's been with his sister all these years. They can gather the rumors whispered throughout the court. I wager it will not take long for their tongues to wag in unison." A hush settled once again. Tywin's lips drew back slightly. "What do you want, Your Grace?" Robert almost laughed. So Tywin was conceding. Some part of him recognized the gravity of the accusation, and that refusal to refute it outright was telling. "I want the truth," Robert said. "And if the truth is that your daughter betrayed me, if these children are not mine, I want them removed from the line of succession. I will have an annulment from her. House Lannister may retain its lands and titles, but I will have justice. If you deny me, if you set yourself against me, I'll declare you and your house traitors to the crown." Even for Tywin, that was a blow. Treason meant a death sentence, or at the very least, a war that would devastate the realm. Tywin's fingers twitched against the table, the only sign of the upheaval inside him. "My daughter should speak for herself," he said at last. "Then let her," Robert snarled. "Summon her here. But know this, Tywin. If she flees, or if your golden boy Jaime tries to hide her away, I'll take that as admission of guilt. The next time we speak, it will be on a battlefield." The threat hung in the air. Tywin rose. "I will speak to her. I assume you will permit me that courtesy." "Speak," Robert said, "but do not take too long. My patience is at its end." Tywin gave the barest incline of his head and left, his cape swirling behind him. Tyrion lingered a moment, glancing at Robert with a curious expression, then scurried after his father. Silence reigned among the council. Robert exhaled, his side throbbing with pain. He turned to Ned, ignoring Varys for the moment. "The storm is coming," Robert said. "We must be ready." Cersei did not appear in the council chambers that day or the next. Instead, Jaime approached Robert, requesting a private audience in the throne room. Robert agreed, though he filled the hall with gold cloaks and had Barristan Selmy standing near the dais. Jaime Lannister, dressed in the white cloak of the Kingsguard, strode in with that casual, arrogant grace that Robert so despised. They faced each other before the Iron Throne, the metal spikes catching the candlelight in ominous flickers. "You asked for me," Robert said. "What is it you want?" Jaime's lips curled into a half-smile. "Am I not sworn to protect you, Your Grace? To serve? My sister is locked in her rooms. She weeps and says you've cast monstrous accusations upon her. I would have your word that you will grant her a fair hearing." Robert almost laughed. "Fair hearing, Kingslayer? Is that what you asked of Ares before you put a sword through his back?" Jaime's face hardened. "I did what was necessary then, and I'll do what is necessary now. I only warn you not to act in haste, or you'll regret it." Robert felt his temper flare, but forced himself calm. "Is that a threat?" "A warning," Jaime repeated. "Cersei is not without allies. If you harm her or her children—" "They are not my children," Robert snapped. Let's speak plainly. You know it. I know it. Ned knows it. The realm will know it soon enough." Jaime's eyes, so like Cersei's, glittered with defiance. "You're certain of that, are you?" "I am." Robert rose from the throne, ignoring the ache in his side. He loomed over Jaime, fists clenched. "You dare to bed my wife under my own roof? You dare to raise bastards in my name? If I'd discovered this years ago, I'd have put your heads on spikes." Jaime did not cower. He stood tall, impossibly cool. "You might find I'm not so easily put on a spike, Robert." It took all of Robert's will not to backhand the man. He imagined smashing Jaime's pretty face with his warhammer, blood spattering the marble floors, but that moment would lead to chaos. Instead, he spat words like venom. "Get out of my sight. Cersei will answer to the council within 2 days. If she doesn't appear, I'll consider her a fugitive. And if you raise your sword against me or my men, I'll crush you like I crushed Rhaegar." Jaime's proud mask faltered ever so slightly at the mention of Rhaegar. Without another word, he turned and strode away. Robert watched him go, every muscle tensed, fury boiling. He wanted this done. Now, a good war might settle the realm, or at least rid him of the Lannisters once and for all. But as Ned had warned, war would be disastrous for thousands of innocents. Robert bore that weight heavily. Once it had not troubled him so. Now something had changed. The near-death experience had impressed upon him the fragility of life, the cost of conflict. On the morning of the second day, Cersei finally emerged. She swept into the throne room clad in regal green and gold, hair piled high on her head, jewels glittering at her throat. She looked every inch a queen, except for the taut lines around her eyes betraying her anger and fear. Jaime was not at her side. Instead, she stood flanked by 2 Lannister guards, not of the King's Guard. Robert had half a mind to order them out, but he allowed them to remain. He sat upon the Iron Throne, Baratheon on one side, Ned on the other, and the gold cloaks ringing the chamber. Cersei's voice rose clear, touching every corner of the hall. "You accuse me of treason, my lord husband? You who scarcely shared my bed these many years, who gallivanted with whores and fathered bastards all across Flea Bottom, and now you dare slander my name? I demand you provide proof to the lords of the realm." Robert glared down at her. "You will not turn this on me. I am the king. Whether I hoard or not is not the point. The point is that Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen are not mine." She lifted her chin. "They are, and I will never confess otherwise." A hush of expectation fell. Robert had predicted she would not admit her guilt. He beckoned Ned, who stood beside the throne. Ned stepped forward, bracing himself. "Your Grace, with your leave?" Robert nodded. He turned a hard stare upon Cersei. "Listen well, for Lord Stark speaks my will." Ned's voice carried a grave authority. He laid out the genealogical evidence, enumerating each Baratheon trait, each Lannister child's features. Then he listed the rumors of Jaime's involvement, the time servants had caught him and the queen alone in suspicious circumstances. He did not mention certain vile whispers of their youth, not yet. Those might come later if needed, but the case was damning enough. Cersei stood rigid, eyes blazing, lips pressed in a thin line. When Ned finished, Robert bellowed, "Now you will answer, Cersei. If you have some counterproof, show it. If not, kneel. Renounce any claim you or your children have upon the throne, and I will show mercy." She stared back defiantly, and for an instant, Robert saw the fear beneath her mask. Fear of losing her power, her children's future, everything. Then, slowly, she lowered her gaze. "I kneel for no man," Cersei said, "especially not a drunken fool who never loved me." Robert's anger broke. He gestured for Barristan Selmy. "Take her into custody. Confine her until we decide her fate." But as Barristan moved forward, swords sang from their scabbards. The 2 Lannister guards stepped protectively in front of Cersei, defiance written on their faces. Cersei's eyes lit with triumph, as though hoping for bloodshed to erupt. Barristan paused, uncertain. The gold cloaks tensed, waiting for Robert's command. Robert rose from the throne, wincing from the twinge in his side, and roared, "Stand down or die where you stand." One guard hesitated, flicking a glance at Cersei. The other remained unwavering. In that charged moment, it seemed as if all might break into chaos. But then the first guard dropped his blade with a clang, stepping back. The second hesitated just long enough for a gold cloak to ram a spear but into his gut, doubling him over. He was swiftly disarmed. Cersei's composure shattered. She turned on Robert with a shriek of pure fury. "You will regret this. You cannot." He cut her off, voice as cold and final as the grave. "Take her away." Baratheon and the guards seized her arms. She struggled, cursing. The last words she spat before they dragged her from the throne room were, "You are no king of mine." The hall fell silent but for the echo of her shouts. Robert stood there, chest heaving. He saw from the corner of his eye that Varys had materialized in the crowd, face set in a mask of polite shock. Farther back, Petyr Baelish wore an inscrutable smile. The courtiers looked stunned by the open arrest of a queen. So it was done, or at least begun. Robert had lit the spark of a potential civil war. The Lannisters would not take this lightly, but he felt a savage satisfaction in that moment. The Lannister hold over him had been broken, and if he had to deal with Tywin's wrath, so be it. Robert turned to Ned. "We must secure Myrcella and Tommen. As for Joffrey, we'll see how he reacts. He's likely to throw a fit. Let him. When this is finished, none of them will be my heirs." Ned nodded. "I will see it done, Your Grace." Word spread like wildfire. The king had cast aside his queen, denounced his children, and imprisoned Cersei. The realm held its breath. Within a day, Jaime disappeared from the Red Keep, likely slipping away to rally the Lannister forces. Tywin, too, vanished from the city under mysterious circumstances. Robert was not surprised. He ordered the gates sealed, the city watch doubled. But King's Landing was vast, and gold could buy many a turn of the head. Stannis counseled immediate martial action. If Tywin is fleeing to Casterly Rock, he means to raise an army. We should strike first, bring the fight to the Westerlands before they gather strength. Ned, ever cautious, proposed reinforcing the capital and sending ravens to the other great houses, explaining the king's position. "We must not appear the aggressors. If we do, some houses may side with Tywin." Robert saw the merits of both arguments. War or diplomacy. The day after Cersei's arrest, Robert convened the small council. Renly seemed uneasy, though he was Robert's brother. He had always had a cordial relationship with Margaery Tyrell's family and, to some extent, the Lannisters. Varys suggested quiet attempts to contact Tyrion Lannister, as the imp might broker a peace. Petyr Baelish said little, but his calculating gaze flickered at every opportunity. Pycelle, white-faced with anxiety, stammered about how no one must harm the queen's person, citing the laws of gods and men. Robert finally rose from his seat, slamming a fist on the table. "I am king, and the law is mine to dispense. If Tywin would make war, then war he shall have. But first, we try to keep the peace if we can. Let the realm see that I have acted justly in removing a false queen. I will not break the realm with a reckless strike unless I must." And so ravens took flight, carrying the king's official accusation. That Cersei Lannister had committed treason and adultery, that her children were in truth fathered by Jaime Lannister, and thus barred from the succession. Robert demanded the support of all true lords of Westeros in upholding the rightful line of succession. He declared that his brother Stannis would be named the heir until such time as Robert sired a legitimate child with a new queen, a matter he did not wish to dwell on yet. One by one, responses came trickling back. Some houses pledged loyalty, some couched their messages in neutrality, and from the Westerlands came only silence. That silence spoke louder than any threat. The tension in the city grew. Gold cloaks patrolled the streets in greater numbers. Whispers abounded that Jaime Lannister was raising troops at Casterly Rock, that Tywin was forging alliances with lesser houses near the Trident and the Reach. The Tyrells remained silent as well, likely weighing which side would serve their ambitions best. Meanwhile, Joffrey lingered in the Red Keep, locked away in his chambers, deeply shaken by his mother's imprisonment. He demanded to see her, but Robert refused. He demanded to see the king, but Robert refused. There was a danger in letting Joffrey wander freely through the castle, stirring up the guards who might still be loyal to the queen. So Joffrey was essentially confined, guarded by men loyal to the crown alone. From time to time, Robert heard the boys' screams of protest echoing through the halls, but he felt no sympathy. If war came, Joffrey might be used as a pawn. That was the depth to which the Lannister children had sunk in Robert's mind. Better a pawn than a king. As the days stretched into weeks, the city stood on the brink of crisis. Nobles loyal to House Baratheon arrived to show support. Lords of the Stormlands, old companions of Robert's. They came with armed men, swelling the city's garrison. In the north, Ned's son Robb Stark remained with his grandfather at Riverrun, but word came that the North had no quarrel with the king's actions. In the Vale, Lysa Arryn's stance was uncertain, but Robert recalled that Lysa detested the Lannisters for their part in her husband's death. They might side with the king as well if coaxed properly. Yet none of it mattered if Tywin Lannister marched east with an army. Robert's health returned in slow degrees. He could now walk the ramparts without too much pain, and he even drilled with his warhammer in the courtyard a few times, to the awe of onlookers who saw the raw power in his swings. The heat of the late summer pressed upon the city, and everyone seemed to wait for the first sign of war. That sign came in the form of a raven from Riverrun. Lord Hoster Tully wrote that men bearing the Lion of Lannister had crossed the Red Fork of the Trident, perhaps testing defenses. A minor skirmish had broken out near the Golden Tooth. There were casualties on both sides. War was begun in all but name. Robert summoned Stannis, Ned, Barristan, and the assembled Stormlords. The question was clear. Do they march west to meet Tywin's forces, or hold King's Landing and let Tywin come to them? Stannis pressed for immediate action, an offensive that might catch Tywin unprepared. Ned preferred to hold strategic positions near the Trident, forcing Tywin into a disadvantageous crossing. Robert weighed each viewpoint. Finally, his warrior's heart prevailed. He would not cower behind walls. He would ride out, crush Tywin's army in open battle, and show the realm the might of House Baratheon. That same day, Robert entered Cersei's cell, an opulent set of chambers that had been hastily repurposed, with guards stationed at every door. She sat by the window, gazing out at the Blackwater rush. When she heard him enter, she turned, eyes rimmed red from tears or fury. "Come to gloat?" she asked coldly. He looked at her for a moment, feeling a stab of old bitterness. Once, he had hoped she might be a worthy companion. That had been years past. Now he saw only a stranger. "I came to tell you that Tywin Lannister has made his move. He's marching on the Riverlands. If he continues, I'll smash his host." She said nothing, merely stared. He crossed his arms. "I could have you executed for treason, you know. I should." A thin smile tugged at her mouth. "But you won't, because if you do, you fear the realm will see it as a tyrant's act. Or perhaps you want me alive in case you lose, so you can barter me for your life. Which is it?" Robert's fury flared, but he kept it in check. "You overestimate your worth. When the war is done, if your family yields, perhaps I'll show mercy. If not, the headsman's block awaits you. Either way, your children will be stripped of claims to the throne." She stood, regal even in captivity, and approached with slow steps. The sunlight caught the gold in her hair. "Do you want to know the truth, Robert?" she whispered, voice trembling with hatred. "Yes, they are Jaime's, all three of them. I couldn't bear to let your seed grow in my belly, to birth a child with your boorish ways, your black hair and drunken roars. I despise you." For an instant, Robert felt the old heartbreak he had known when Lyanna died, leaving him with an emptiness he'd never truly filled. But he smothered that pain in anger. "You've admitted your treason, then?" She laughed, bitter as gall. "You knew it all along. You just refused to see. Now do what you will. I do not fear you. "I don't want your fear," Robert said quietly. "I want your house beaten, so thoroughly it can never threaten me again." He turned and strode out, fists clenched at his sides. He gave orders to the guards that Cersei was to receive no visitors, not even her children, unless Robert himself gave permission. That was the last time he spoke to her before marching west. The war that followed tested Robert in ways he had not faced since the rebellion. Leading an army while grappling with the new treacheries of the realm was no small task. But he was Robert Baratheon, the Storm Lord, and he had faced worse odds in his youth. Soldiers rallied to him, reminded of the legend he had once been, the mighty warrior who felled Rhaegar Targaryen on the Trident. Now that same fury burned in him again, stoked by betrayal and near death. He wrote letters to every lord he could think of, promising that justice would be done once Tywin was defeated. He ordered Renly to remain in King's Landing to ensure no coup occurred while the king was absent. Stannis rode at his side, commanding a portion of the royal forces. Ned Stark led the men of the North and the Riverlands in unison, forging a powerful host. They converged near Harrenhal, forming a grand army that stretched the horizon. Scouts reported Tywin's movements near the Golden Tooth, growing in strength with each passing day as Lannister bannermen joined. At last, the moment came to march upon the Lannisters. Battle lines were drawn across the rolling plains near the Red Fork, the fields turning gold under the late summer sun. Robert rode at the head of his knights, warhammer in hand. Even with the lingering pain in his side, he felt alive for the first time in years, the thunder of hooves beneath him stirring old memories of the rebellion. At his flank rode Stannis, austere and grim, and Ned Stark, solemn but resolute. The banners of the Baratheon stag, the Stark direwolf, and the Tully trout flew side by side. On the opposing slope, a sea of crimson and gold banners fluttered, the Lion of Lannister. Robert's scouts reported that Tywin commanded the center, with Jaime leading a cavalry wing. Before the horn signaled the charge, Ned ventured a last caution. "If we can get Tywin to talk, perhaps a parley might prevent unnecessary slaughter." Robert shook his head. "He wants blood, Ned. Perhaps he wants vengeance for his daughter's arrest. Perhaps he sees me as weakened by scandal. Either way, we've passed the point of no return. This ends today." With that, the horns blew. The earth trembled under the force of cavalry surging forward. Arrows darkened the sky. The Lannisters roared in response, their lines bristling with steel. Robert shouted a war cry, brandishing his warhammer. The distance between the two armies vanished in heartbeats. And then the world dissolved into chaos. They crashed together like tidal waves, men and horses screaming, steel ringing on steel. Robert hewed through the first line of Lannister spears, his warhammer crushing shields and bones alike. Pain flared in his side, but he rode through it, unstoppable as a storm. Stannis and Ned led their own flanks, carving a path through the chaos. The banners swirled amid the dust and blood, armies mingling in a deadly dance. At one point, Robert glimpsed Jaime Lannister's golden hair flashing in the sun. The Kingslayer was in the thick of the fight, blade flickering with lethal grace. Robert bellowed his name, spurring his horse toward him, determined to meet steel with the man who had defiled his wife. But the press of battle separated them. A hail of arrows forced Robert to wheel aside, shouting commands to rally a shield wall. The clang of swords and the shrieks of wounded horses filled the air with a cacophony of horror. Hours seemed to pass in that maelstrom of violence. Men died in droves. The cry of "For the King!" mingled with dying screams. Robert's arm grew heavy with each swing of his hammer, and blood spattered his tabard. Stannis rallied the right flank, holding back a fierce cavalry charge led by the Marbrand bannermen. Ned drove into the Lannister center, forcing them to fall back across the riverbank. Once, a Lannister knight nearly unhorsed Robert with a lance thrust, but the king smashed it aside and caved in the man's breastplate with a single blow. At last, amid the swirling dust, the Lannister lines began to buckle. Word spread that Tywin's standard had fallen, that the lion banner lay in the mud. Robert seized upon that, bellowing for a general advance. Trumpets sounded, and the Baratheon forces surged forward in one relentless wave. The Lannisters, exhausted and bloodied, tried to regroup, but the impetus was gone. Their flank collapsed. Men threw down their weapons and fled, or were cut down where they stood. By sunset, the field belonged to Robert Baratheon. Bodies lay strewn across the grass, the streams running red with blood. Robert dismounted, gasping for breath, sweat mixing with dirt and gore. He clutched his side, feeling a fresh sting where the bandages had torn. But he stood victorious. The Lannister host was broken, scattered. Many had surrendered or died. Tywin himself was nowhere to be found. Some said he fled mid-battle when he saw the tide turn, leaving the younger commanders in disarray. Jaime had vanished as well, last seen dueling a cluster of northern bannermen before cutting his way free. Exhausted cheers resounded through the Baratheon lines. Ned Stark limped over, sword dripping. Stannis arrived, his face like a thundercloud. "We have victory," Stannis said. "Tywin is undone for now." "But not dead," Ned cautioned. "He'll retreat to Casterly Rock." "Even so, this has been a crushing blow to their power." Robert nodded, chest heaving. "We'll press on," he said, wincing against the pain in his ribs. "Let them hide behind their rock. I'll root them out." Yet the day belonged to Robert. He had survived the boar's tusk and cheated death. He had faced the Lannisters on the field of battle and emerged triumphant. As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky a blazing orange, Robert stood amid the wreckage, a dark figure spattered with blood but unbowed. A hush fell across the field, broken by ragged cheers. In that moment, he was Robert Baratheon of old. A warrior king, unbreakable, unstoppable. When he finally turned away, commanding his men to tend the wounded and gather prisoners, he felt an odd mixture of triumph and sorrow. The cost in lives was immense, as always, but if this ended the Lannister threat, perhaps the realm would know peace. Perhaps he could forge a new future, one untainted by treachery, unburdened by a false heir. His eyes lifted to the horizon, where the last vestiges of daylight clung to the sky. Yes, he had survived the boar's tusk. He had broken the Lannisters' ambitions, at least for now. Tomorrow, a new chapter would begin, and the Seven Kingdoms would see what sort of King Robert Baratheon truly was when faced with the consequences of a war he had deemed necessary. Yet for all that, he felt a stirring of grim satisfaction in his heart. He was no longer content to be a drunken shadow upon the throne. He was awake and alive, every nerve alight with purpose. The cost would be high, but he would pay it. He would make the realm remember that Robert Baratheon was the Stormlord who had once toppled dragons, and if the Lannisters still dared to stand against him, he would topple lions just as easily. Night had fully fallen by the time Robert Baratheon finally allowed himself a moment's rest beyond the battlefield. He stood outside a command tent pitched on ground still slick with blood and muddied by the churn of cavalry. Torches flickered along the perimeter, revealing the torn standards of vanquished Lannister men scattered through the dark. Every breath he drew felt like fire in his wounded side, but he refused to yield to the pain. The familiar ache of battle injuries was almost comforting, a reminder that he had survived another trial that might have claimed a weaker man. Inside the tent, Stannis, Ned Stark, and a handful of High Lords stood bent over a crude map of the Riverlands. Oil lamps lit their faces from below, casting deep shadows. Their expressions, solemn and exhausted, carried the weight of victory tempered by the knowledge that war seldom ended with a single field won. When Robert entered, the low murmur of their conversation ceased. Stannis inclined his head in silent greeting, and Ned stepped aside to grant the king access to the map. No one made a move to sit. The tension clinging to the air was too thick. Robert's gaze roamed the rough lines and markers that showed where Tywin's host had broken and scattered. According to the Outriders, pockets of Lannister troops still roamed the countryside, but the main body had fled west or surrendered. Of Tywin himself, there had been no confirmed sightings since midday. Merely rumor that his personal guard had abandoned the field early. "Lions do not typically slink away like frightened foxes," Robert muttered. "That old lion still has fangs. No matter how this day went, Stannis's stern features creased in a frown. If he manages to regroup at Casterly Rock, we'll face a protracted siege. The rock is nearly unassailable from the sea, well provisioned from inland roads. We'll need time to muster siege engines if we're to break it, and time is a commodity we don't have in abundance. Ned nodded, quietly agreeing. Winter is coming, and already the harvests have been uncertain across the Riverlands. The common folk cannot endure a long war of attrition. We must act swiftly or bring Tywin to heel some other way. Robert exhaled sharply, the breath hissing between his teeth. I want him broken, he said, the anger that had sustained him through the battle still simmering behind his eyes. This war began the moment he let his daughter lie to me for years and dared to raise bastards in my name. It's too late for half measures. The lords present, men of the Stormlands, the Riverlands, and the North, bowed their heads in acceptance. They were weary from the day's carnage, but a certain grim satisfaction lingered. Many had old grievances against the Lannisters. Now they had a king determined to see justice done, or so they believed. Yet Robert, for all his bravado, could not ignore the losses he himself had suffered that day. Hundreds of good men lay dead or dying among the churned fields. He wondered how many widows and orphans would curse his name. A chunk of him wanted to say it was all Cersei's fault, or Tywin's, or Jaime's, or the gods themselves. But in his heart, Robert knew he had set this in motion the moment he arrested his queen and proclaimed her children illegitimate. However justified it was, the realm was now drenched in more blood. He set his jaw, determined to see it through. He straightened, ignoring the stab in his ribs. We'll allow our men what rest they can get tonight. In the morning we press west. Dispatch riders to the minor riverlords whose lands we pass. Let them know the king requires their roads, their supplies, their loyalty. We will not tarry. We will not linger. If Tywin thinks to find refuge, he'll find none. I want to reach the borders of the Westerlands before he's had time to reorganize. No one argued. Even Stannis, who often chafed at Robert's impulsiveness, nodded agreement. Perhaps he, too, saw the merit in an immediate advance. A respite would benefit Tywin far more than Robert. Already ravens were doubtless winging toward the rock, carrying news of defeat. If Tywin's forces needed time to regroup, Robert would not give it to them. They spoke then of logistics, which paths to take, what watchers to leave behind, how to handle the wounded. Ned insisted on leaving enough men to ensure the captured Lannisters could not rally. Stannis suggested sending outriders deeper into the Westerlands to sow confusion. The Stormlords grunted and agreed. Little by little, a plan took shape. The king's host would press on, swiftly and relentlessly, through the Riverlands, crossing near the Gold Road to push into Lannister territory. Along the way, they would gather loyal banners from lords who had pledged to the crown. House Tully, emboldened by victory on its own soil, would send additional men led by Edmure Tully himself. Word would also be sent to the north, though the likelihood of more northern banners arriving in time was slim. Distance and winter's hints made that uncertain. Still, Ned was confident his son Robb and the North would stand by the king if the war dragged on. At last, the meeting ended. Robert lingered a moment after the lords departed, letting the lamplight warm his face. Outside the tent, a cold wind stirred. He craved the quiet hum of strong wine on his tongue, but some newly steadied part of him refused. There would be no drunken wallowing tonight. He had come too close to death. He had seen the realm slide toward ruin. He would keep his mind clear, at least while the war raged. Ned hovered by the entrance. Your Grace, you should have Pycelle or the maesters tend that wound again. You bled through the bandage. Robert glanced down. The linen wrap beneath his mail was stained a dark red. Pain pulsed with every heartbeat, but he merely gave a dismissive shrug. I've lived with worse. It will keep until tomorrow. Ned took a breath as if to press further, but he saw the look in Robert's eyes and let it be. Very well. Rest if you can. Robert nodded. You do the same. Yet neither man found much rest that night. The moans of the wounded carried through the dark, and the faint smell of corpses washed over the camp on shifting winds. Robert moved among the tents in the smallest hours, at times pausing to clasp the hand of a dying soldier or to exchange a few words with survivors. It was something he had not done in the rebellion's heyday. Back then, he had been the unstoppable young warrior. Now, older and with so many regrets, he felt compelled to see the price of his decisions. He wondered if it was too little, too late, but he could not stop himself. Dawn arrived in gray hush, dew glistening upon battered swords and hoarse tack. Their war drums sounded soon after, summoning men to break camp. In a matter of hours, the king's host was on the march. The battered Lannister banners left behind served as a warning to any who might think to hinder their advance. They traversed the riverlands with speed, rarely pausing more than a day at a time. Streams and minor fords slowed them, as did the occasional skirmish with stray Lannister detachments. But the news that the king himself led a great host, alongside Lord Eddard Stark and Lord Stannis Baratheon, traveled quickly. Here and there, smaller houses declared themselves at the crown's disposal, sending riders or wagons of supplies. Peasants, ragged from the toll of war, lined the roads to watch in anxious awe. Rumors abounded that Robert had cast aside the queen for unnatural acts, that the children in the Red Keep were abominations. But Robert seldom bothered to refute or confirm these whispers. He let fear of the king's wrath do half the work, and he pressed onward. Within a fortnight, they neared the rolling hills that marked the eastern edges of the Westerlands. The land turned rockier, richer in iron and gold beneath the soil, peppered with mines that had fed House Lannister's coffers for centuries. Whatever watchers Tywin had left behind vanished at the approach of the royal army. Along the main roads, they found only abandoned villages or peasants too poor or frightened to flee. Once, a Lannister outrider tried to harass the supply wagons, but Ned's men quickly ran him down. It seemed Tywin had not yet mustered a second army to bar the way. He was likely consolidating at Casterly Rock, bracing for a siege. Robert felt a grim satisfaction. One more step and the lion would be cornered. Still, the approach to the rock was fraught with potential perils. The fortress commanded a vantage of the surrounding countryside, perched upon a colossal stone promontory by the sea. Its tunnels ran deep, its walls thick, and the Lannisters had wealth enough to buy siege engineers or mercenaries if they wished. Robert wanted to strike before they gathered new strength. He gave the order to continue marching west, with the plan to encamp near the small harbor town below Casterly Rock. From there, they could block sea access and begin to starve out the fortress if Tywin refused to come forth. Yet as they advanced, their outriders returned with perplexing news. The roads leading to the rock were torn up, as if someone had been felling trees to create barricades. In places, great heaps of rubble or sharpened stakes blocked the way. It was not a full fortification, but rather a sign of hasty sabotage, a delaying tactic. Stannis ground his teeth at the reports. "They mean to slow us, to buy time." Robert ordered the men to clear paths, but each obstruction took hours or days to remove. When the king's host was forced to detour around a collapsed hillside, the local guides spoke of narrow passes and hidden ravines. Any of them could be a site of ambush. Tensions rose as they pushed onward. Every day's delay felt like a gift to Tywin Lannister. One afternoon, as the vanguard picked its way through a gorge, the king rode with Ned at the head, flanked by a double column of knights. The canyon walls pressed in on both sides, steep and rocky. Fog clung to the heights. Robert's warhammer hung at his saddle, and his battered armor showed fresh scuffs from minor clashes. Ned wore a grim expression, scanning the ridges. They both felt the hairs at the nape of their neck rising. A horn sounded, echoing ominously down the gorge. Then a hail of arrows rained from above. Horses screamed. Men shouted. Chaos erupted. Robert bellowed for the knights to raise shields, spurred his destrier forward. High up on the ridges, hidden behind rocks, Lannister scouts or bandits fired volley after volley. Several Baratheon men toppled, shafts sprouting from their necks or shoulders. Ned's horse took an arrow in the flank but remained upright, rearing in panic. "Forward!" Robert roared, lifting his hammer to rally the men. "Out of the gorge! Form ranks!" The road was narrow, the walls rising in steep crags. More arrows whistled down. Then a second horn blast signaled movement at the far end. Boulders came tumbling, dislodged by the attackers, crashing onto the path. A group of men in half-sunlight charged the vanguard, fewer than 100, but swift and desperate. They were clad in bits of red and gold livery, though many had the ragged look of sellswords or local brigands. Still, they wore the lion's mark proudly enough. Ned, ignoring the pain of his mount, wheeled about and shouted for his men to meet the attack. Robert thundered into their midst, hammer smashing aside a Lannister spearman as easily as a child's doll. Sparks flew as steel met steel. More men poured forward to aid the king, and the air filled with the sickening sounds of battle. It was a vicious skirmish. The narrow terrain favored the ambushers, who could fire arrows from heights and then scramble away among the rocks. Robert and Ned's men were forced to fight uphill at times, losing horses to arrow fire. Slowly, step by bloody step, the king's vanguard advanced. Eventually, they overcame the barricade that had been erected at the far end of the gorge, dragging it aside while archers behind them traded shafts with the hidden Lannister men. After nearly an hour, the ambushers began to retreat, vanishing like ghosts into the crags. Robert, panting and enraged, wanted to chase them, but Ned cautioned that sending men up the ridge would expose them to further ambush. They had won the gorge, albeit at a cost of dozens of dead and wounded. By dusk, the main host managed to pass through. Corpses littered the rock-strewn floor. Pyres were lit for the loyal dead, while the Lannister bodies were left for crows or pitched into ravines. Robert swore vengeance for every man lost to this cowardly tactic. He paced among the wounded, cursing under his breath. In the flicker of torchlight, his face looked carved from stone. "This is Tywin's handiwork," he spat at Ned. "He wants to harass us, bleed us with pinpricks, so that by the time we reach his gates, we're too weakened for a real fight." Ned drew off his helm, letting the night air cool his sweat-soaked hair. "That is his way. Tywin is patient, calculating. He'll do anything to preserve House Lannister. We'll see how he fares when the full might of the crown stands at his doorstep," Robert snarled. "He'll pay for every drop of blood spilled today." The men set up a makeshift camp in the gorge's wider section, but no one felt safe. Archers kept watch on the heights, scanning for any sign of movement. They saw none. Whoever had attacked was gone, presumably to regroup or to lay fresh traps elsewhere along the road. The king ordered scouts to find alternative routes, but every pass, every winding defile in these stony hills, posed the same risk. They would have to proceed cautiously. On the second day after the ambush, word reached them from another column of the army. More sabotage had been found, along with small-scale attacks on foraging parties. The entire region seemed to bristle with Lannister loyalists, or men paid to fight like devils in the name of House Lannister. The king's outriders scoured the hills, capturing a handful of renegades. Under questioning, with Stannis's typically severe method, these prisoners confessed to receiving gold from Casterly Rock to harass the royal troops. Robert had them executed without mercy. Grim orders were issued for any local who fired upon the king's host. No quarter would be granted. Slowly but surely, the army pressed onward. Days blurred together in an unrelenting grind: march, clear obstructions, fend off sniping attacks, bury the dead, then march again. Morale flagged in places, and Robert was forced to rouse his men's spirits with boisterous promises of triumph and spoils. It was a different sort of war than the rebellion, lacking the grand battles of open fields. This was a war of attrition, where every gully and ridge could conceal deadly threats. Robert despised it, but he refused to be undone by Tywin's cunning. At last, after nearly another fortnight of grueling progress, they emerged onto the broader foothills that lay between the mountains and the sea. From a high ridge on a clear morning, Robert, Ned, and Stannis looked west and saw, in the far distance, the faint glimmer of the sunset sea. There, perched upon massive stone bluffs, rose the dominating shape of Casterly Rock, as imposing as a titan. Even at a league's distance, the fortress overshadowed the coastline, rising from the rocky promontory like a natural extension of the land itself. From the vantage, one could glimpse a small harbor sprawled below, where a smattering of ships bobbed. Robert squinted, spotting red and gold pennants snapping in the ocean wind. "That's where Tywin's retreated," Ned said quietly, as if in awe of the fortress's grandeur. "And if the rumors are true, Jaime is with him, along with whatever Lannister men remain in the Westerlands." Robert's voice rumbled low in his chest. "Then that's where we'll finish this. I'll camp at the base of that blasted rock if I must." Stannis folded his arms. "We should seize the harbor first, block any attempt to bring in supplies by sea or escape that way. The Lannisters have their own ships, but not so many that we can't challenge them on land if they attempt to put to sail. We may not have a true navy here, but a well-fortified position with scorpions and catapults might keep any fleet at bay." Robert nodded in agreement. "A siege it will be, though I'd sooner flush Tywin out to meet me in open battle. But if he hides behind his walls, so be it." They descended from the ridge and gave orders to the host. They would sweep around to the south and come at the rock from along the shoreline, forcing any retreating Lannisters to either face them or huddle within the fortress. Word was sent to the columns still approaching from the east, instructing them to converge on the same point. The final confrontation loomed. That very evening, as they made camp in the rolling hills, a dispatch rider returned with startling news. He claimed to carry a missive from Tyrion Lannister, who had apparently not been at Casterly Rock but instead in the nearby hills, rallying lesser lords. Tyrion's letter bore the seal of House Lannister but was far from a straightforward plea. It contained an offer. Tyrion would meet with the king under a flag of truce to discuss terms, if Robert agreed to parley. The letter was worded with careful courtesy, disclaiming that he wrote at his father's behest, though the tone suggested Tyrion might have his own agenda. Robert read the parchment twice. Ned and Stannis hovered, each wearing a guarded expression. Baelish, who had accompanied the host to offer financial counsel, arched a brow in interest. Varys was not with them. He remained in King's Landing, presumably to watch for any fresh intrigues there, so they had little immediate insight into Tyrion's true aim. But the gist was clear enough. House Lannister wanted to talk or at least stall. Stannis was the first to speak. "It's a trick. He'll want to buy time while Tywin fortifies further." Ned was less certain. "Tyrion Lannister has a reputation for cunning, but he may also be a realist. He could see that the war is lost if the king's host lays full siege." Baelish, with his ever-present half-smile, added, "If I may, Your Grace, Tyrion is known to value his own survival above nearly anything else. He may offer up something you find worthwhile." Robert snorted. "Words from a dwarf. I won't trust them without cause. But if he wants to meet, I'll hear what he has to say. Let him speak for his father's crimes." Ned still looked uneasy. "I advise caution. Choose the meeting place carefully." "Don't fear, Ned," Robert said. "I'll not go alone into any trap." They arranged the parley at a wide, open field near a broken ruin that local peasants called the Lion's Stand. Some old watchtower crumbled to its foundations. The next day, Robert and a contingent of knights rode out to the site. They arrived before midday and set a ring of mounted archers around the clearing, ensuring no ambush could descend unseen. Tyrion Lannister arrived shortly after, accompanied by a small escort of armed riders bearing no banners. Robert recognized a few minor Westerland sigils among them, the Crakehalls, the SWYFTS, but their numbers were too few to pose a real threat. Tyrion himself dismounted with practiced care, favoring his shorter legs. He wore a half-cloak of crimson velvet, the Lion of Lannister embroidered on the breast, yet he had no illusions of grandeur. He bowed as best he could in the king's direction and offered a faint, sardonic smile. "Your Grace," Tyrion said, "I trust we meet under the strictest courtesy of a parley? I'd hate to lose my head before we even begin. It's so difficult to have a proper conversation without one." Robert's mood was foul, but he kept it in check for the sake of formality. "You have my word so long as you come in peace. State your business." Tyrion's mismatched eyes flicked across the ring of guards, then settled on Robert. My father desires an end to the bloodshed. He knows the tide has turned against our house for the moment. But House Lannister is not yet without resources. He would propose a truce. In exchange, he will—" Robert barked a laugh, the sound laced with bitterness. "A truce? So he can slip away and plan new treacheries? Why would I spare him?" Tyrion raised a hand in a mollifying gesture. "Allow me to finish, Your Grace. My father would accept certain penalties, perhaps large reparations in gold, hostages to guarantee good behavior, and, if it please you, recognition of your newly declared heir, Stannis Baratheon, or whomever else you choose, as next in line. He will forfeit any claim that Joffrey, Myrcella, or Tommen might have had." That last was said carefully. Robert's guards stirred, exchanging glances. Robert himself felt a surge of conflicting emotions. The idea of Tywin groveling was appealing, but he was not so naive as to think Tywin Lannister would simply kneel and pay gold without further aims. "He'll forfeit the children's claims?" Robert echoed, voice thick with scorn. "That's generous of him, considering they never had a true claim to begin with." Tyrion grimaced. "True, but public acknowledgement of that travesty is the main point of strife, is it not? My father is prepared to concede that you have indeed proven your assertion. No further illusions. He likewise acknowledges that Queen Cersei stands accused and is under your justice. He does not ask for her release, though I suspect he'd prefer she remains alive." Robert's anger flared at the mention of Cersei. He saw again the hateful twist of her mouth when she confessed her infidelity. "I could have had her head," he said, "and might yet." Tyrion's mouth tightened. "Then at least allow me to propose an alternative. Exile or life imprisonment for her, rather than execution. Father would not take kindly to seeing his daughter's head on a spike. That is the only part of your current stance that truly offends him beyond reason." Robert snorted. "If I care about Tywin's offense, I'll say so." Tyrion spread his hands. "We Lannisters pay our debts, but we do not forget our grievances, either. If you insist upon Cersei's death, I assure you my father will not rest until House Baratheon is ended as well. Perhaps he cannot accomplish that today or tomorrow, but House Lannister's gold is vast, and grudges do not fade easily." A hush followed. Tyrion spoke calmly, but the threat lay beneath his words like a coiled viper. Robert thought of the realm, of the potential for more cycles of violence if Tywin decided to wage a shadow war for years. The king's face hardened. "I'm meant to be intimidated by the promise of vengeance from a cornered lion?" Robert muttered. "I suspect your father values his own skin enough to stand down, unless he's so blinded by pride that he'd rather see the West burned." Tyrion let out a slow breath. "I'm only the messenger, Your Grace, though I speak with more honesty than most. My father is formidable, but he's also rational, unless you push him to a point of no return. I came here to see if the conflict can be settled without subjecting the entire realm to further ravages. If you want him to kneel, he might kneel. But if you demand blood for all the days of your marriage's deception, you'll have war until no one has the strength to fight." Robert's gaze flickered to Ned, who stood silently at his side. Ned's face betrayed a trace of unease, as if even he saw that some arrangement short of total annihilation might spare the realm. But Ned left it to Robert to speak. The king scowled, rolling his broad shoulders inside his plate. He was not used to half measures. He had come here to break Tywin once and for all, yet Tyrion's words held a certain truth. However battered House Lannister might be on the field, its gold and cunning could cause endless turmoil. "Your father attacked me," Robert said at length. "He knew or condoned Cersei's treachery. He tried to kill me during the hunt. If not him, then someone in league with him. He raised armies against the crown, waged war in the Riverlands, ambushed my men in the passes. You want me to let him off with a slap on the wrist?" Tyrion's lips curved into a wry smile. "Hardly a slap, Your Grace. The gold Tywin is prepared to pay is vast. He will deliver substantial hostages as well, Kevin Lannister, perhaps, or even certain young heirs of the Westerlands. You may choose them. That, coupled with the admission that the children are not yours, means they will never contest your line of succession again. He will also release any prisoners from the Riverlands or Stormlands he holds, if there are any. And once you come to an accord, the West will yield. Tywin has no appetite to see his house destroyed, but if you press him without mercy, you may force him into desperate measures. Robert stood silent, weighing it. A hush fell. In the distance, the flutter of crows' wings carried over the field. Finally, he turned to Ned, seeking counsel without speaking. Ned lowered his voice. "It might be the realm's best chance for peace, Robert," he murmured. "A battered Lannister host, heavy reparations, a confession that the children are bastards, hostages to ensure good faith. If we force them to kneel in front of the realm, it would cement your victory. The alternative is to attempt a long siege or a final assault, but that could cost thousands more lives. If we destroy the Lannisters, the Iron Islands might revolt. The Tyrells might sense an opportunity. The realm could unravel." Robert's jaw tightened. He saw sense in Ned's words, though it galled him to think Tywin might walk away with his head held high. Still, what was the alternative? The king's side had lost men in droves during the march. Another pitched fight or a grueling siege might devastate them. A single mistake could see Tywin slip away or bribe foreign sellswords, turning the war into an endless quagmire. At last, Robert faced Tyrion again. "If your father wants peace, let him bend the knee in person before me, in front of his own gates. Let him pay for my war costs and put forth whomever I name as hostages. Let him renounce all claim of my so-called children, and vow that if any of them, Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen, ever tries to claim the throne or stirs rebellion, they will face Lannister blades themselves. As for Cersei, she remains my prisoner. I'll decide what to do with her in time." Tyrion listened intently. "And you would spare the West from sack or siege, in exchange for Tywin's absolute submission?" "I will accept his submission on those terms," Robert said, his voice like iron. "But if he so much as breathes in defiance, if he delays or tries to play me for a fool, I'll bring fire and blood to his gates. And I'll see that the name of Lannister becomes a memory." Tyrion gave a small, tight nod. "I understand. I believe Father will understand as well. If I may, I ask for safe passage to carry your demands back to him." Robert waved a dismissive hand. "You have it, but do not tarry, dwarf. I'll not wait forever in these hills. If we see no sign of your father's compliance within a fortnight, I march on Casterly Rock. And no terms or gold will save him then." Tyrion offered a half-bow. "My thanks, your grace. One last matter, if I might be so bold." He hesitated as if treading dangerous ground. "You have my sister in King's Landing. If you would ensure that no harm befalls her before these negotiations conclude, I would be most grateful." Robert's mouth twitched with contempt. "Her fate is mine to decide. Not yours, not Tywin's. If your father gives me reason, I might spare her. But if he defies me, he let the threat hang. You'd do well to counsel him on that." The dwarf's features tightened, but he said no more. He gave another bow, turned, and limped back to his waiting escort. The lines of archers parted to allow them to depart. Robert stared after him, a storm of emotions swirling. He remembered how close he'd come to dying by a boar's tusk, or by unseen poison. Had the Lannisters truly conspired to kill him, or had it been Cersei alone? Perhaps it hardly mattered. The damage was done. He wanted House Lannister subdued, and if Tywin could be forced to bend the knee, so be it. That evening, as the king and his commanders rode back to the main camp, they conferred quietly about whether Tywin would even accept such demands. Some believed Tywin would refuse, pride ruling his heart. Others suspected he might attempt half measures or deception. Robert had already ordered his men to prepare siege towers and catapults, just in case. He would not be taken for a fool, but there was a ripple of guarded hope that maybe, just maybe, the war could end without another massacre. They waited. Day after day, the host edged closer to Casterly Rock, establishing a broad encampment near the coastal road. Lookouts watched the sea for Lannister galleys. Scouts patrolled inland routes to prevent any infiltration. No major confrontation arose, but tension hovered like thunderclouds. Twice more, small bands of Lannister loyalists attempted to harass supply lines. Both times they were swiftly crushed. Each time, Robert had the prisoners hanged along the roadsides as a warning. A week passed with no sign from Tyrion or Tywin. Some of Robert's lords began to grumble, urging him to proceed with the siege. Others cautioned patience, for the field was not easy ground for a mass assault. Robert's anger simmered. He had set a limit of a fortnight. If the Lannisters did not comply by then, he would keep his word and unleash a storm. On the 9th day, dust plumes appeared on the horizon. A large party approached beneath white banners of truce. Robert's outriders galloped in with word that it was indeed Tyrion returned, with a contingent of knights flying the lion's standard, but presumably in peace. The king assembled his council and rode out to meet them on open ground, again ringed by loyal archers. What came next would shape the future of the realm. Tyrion rode at the head of a column of Lannister men, perhaps 200. Among them were a handful of banners from lesser Westerland houses. At their center, a tall figure in richly wrought armor guided a warhorse. Robert stiffened in his saddle, recognizing the pale blonde hair beneath the helmet. Tywin Lannister had come in person. The Lannister column halted some 50 yards away. A hush fell across the field. Then Tywin himself spurred his horse forward, flanked by Tyrion and 3 knights wearing gilded plate. Robert waited, hammer across his saddle, flanked by Ned and Stannis. Every man present could feel the tension crackle in the wind. Robert studied Tywin's face. The Lord of Casterly Rock bore the expression of a man swallowing molten lead. His green eyes were cold, but some muscle in his jaw twitched. This was not a man accustomed to bending. Yet here he was, riding into the king's camp without the protective walls of his fortress. They stopped a few paces apart. For a moment, neither side spoke. Robert let Tywin see the scorn in his face, as well as the threat. Finally, the old lion dismounted, handing the reins to one of his knights. He straightened with dignity, removed his helm, and stared at Robert. Then, slowly, deliberately, Tywin Lannister sank to one knee in the dust. He said nothing at first, only bowed his head. Robert found he could not suppress the faint grin tugging at his lips, a mixture of savage triumph and wary acknowledgement. He knew how this moment must gall Tywin's pride. For all the cunning and gold in the world, the Lord of Casterly Rock was forced to kneel before the man he had long considered a careless, drunken fool. At last, Tywin spoke, voice measured but taut. I, Tywin of House Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock and Shield of Lannisport, hereby submit to you, Robert Baratheon, the first of your name, King of the Undulls and the First Men, in order to spare the further shedding of blood among the realm. Robert let the silence stretch. Each heartbeat felt like a hammer blow. He could almost taste Tywin's fury. A part of him wanted to spurn the offer, to order Tywin dragged through the mud as punishment for all he had done. But Robert also saw the watchful eyes of Ned, Stannis, and the assembled lords behind him. The realm stood on a precipice. If Tywin was truly yielding, it might keep the realm from drowning in war. With a grunt, Robert signaled for Tywin to rise. You know my terms, he said, not bothering with pleasantries. Reparations for the war, hostages from House Lannister, a formal renunciation of the false heirs. If you accept all that, and kneel again in the sight of your own gates, I will call off this war. Tywin exhaled, quietly, but tension wreathed every line of his face. We accept. Speak it, Robert demanded, so all can hear. A muscle jumped in Tywin's cheek. He inclined his head. We accept your terms. House Lannister will pay a king's ransom in gold for damages done to the Riverlands, the Stormlands, and the Crown's forces. We will supply as hostages Ser Kevan Lannister and 3 of his sons, as well as Lord Brax's heir and, if further surety is required, whomever else you name. And we will publicly renounce any claim that Joffrey, Myrcella, or Tommen might have upon the Iron Throne. They are bastards, born of Cersei and my son Jaime, not of your blood. Robert stared down at him, letting the words echo. A hush had fallen among both retinues. The Lannister knights looked on with stoic faces. Tyrion stood somewhat apart, his expression veiled. Many of Robert's men shifted restlessly, uncertain how to respond to the dramatic confession. "And what of your daughter, the so-called queen?" Robert pressed. "You demand her life?" Tywin's voice grew even colder. "I request, not demand, that she be spared. Exile or permanent confinement as you see fit. In exchange for that act of mercy, House Lannister will remain loyal to the crown." Robert let the silence draw out. In truth, he had not fully decided Cersei's fate. Part of him wanted her dead for her betrayal. But public spectacle aside, he recognized the advantage in holding her as a living piece of leverage. "We will see," he said. "I give no assurances, but your capitulation pleases me. Prove your loyalty in the coming days, and your daughter may live." "Now is that all?" Tywin rose stiffly to his feet, exhaustion and anger crossing his face for just an instant before he mastered himself. "We will do as you command, your grace." "Then you'll lead me to your gates," Robert declared, raising his voice so all could hear. "You will kneel again in front of your own walls. Let all the West see that the lion has bent to the stag." Tywin did not argue. He only nodded. Tyrion bowed his head in evident relief, as if some great weight had shifted. Robert motioned for Ned, Stannis, and their lords to surround him, and so they did. The sun climbed overhead, bathing the field in a harsh light, revealing the lines of weariness etched on every face. Under the watchful guard of hundreds, the combined party rode toward Casterly Rock. The approach took the better part of the day, winding down coastal roads until the vast fortress loomed overhead like a crouching beast. From the battlements, watchers peered down, some in Lannister colors, uncertain whether to fire or throw open the gates. At Robert's command, horns sounded, proclaiming the king's arrival. Tywin lifted a gloved hand in a sign that all was well. They halted upon the broad stone causeway that led to the main gates. Crimson banners with golden lions hung limp in the still air. It was an imposing sight, the walls carved into the rock itself, an ancient stronghold that had never fallen to siege. Robert remembered hearing the old boast that Casterly Rock was as impregnable as Harrenhal had once claimed to be. But standing there now, at the head of his victorious host, Robert felt the surge of pride. The lion might have the biggest den in Westeros, but the stag had come to claim it. Silence blanketed the causeway. With soldiers massed behind him, Robert turned to Tywin. "On your knees, Lord of the Rock," he said quietly, though his voice carried in the hush. For an instant, he thought Tywin might refuse. Pride warred in the old man's eyes. Then, slowly, Tywin stepped forward, sank down on both knees, and bowed his head before his gates. The Lannister knights on the walls stood frozen, uncertain whether to watch or look away. Tyrion looked pained, as though he half expected his father to rise in fury. But Tywin stayed kneeling, a silent testament to submission. Robert dismounted and walked forward, the ring of watchers parting for him. He stood over Tywin, warhammer in hand, letting the hush linger. "Hear me, all loyal vassals of House Lannister," Robert called, raising his voice so it bounced off the towering walls. "Your lord has bent the knee. The West is now loyal to the Iron Throne, to Robert Baratheon, and acknowledges my rightful line. Let no man speak again of treason or rebellion. House Lannister is spared destruction because I am merciful, but let any further treachery be met with fire and blood." When the echo of his words faded, Tywin slowly rose. For the first time, his stern mask cracked. A flicker of deeply contained rage showed in the set of his mouth, in the tightness around his eyes. But he managed a short bow. "You have our loyalty, your grace. Open your gates," Robert commanded. At a signal from Tywin, the portcullis rose, the heavy iron chains rattling in the fortress's depths. Robert gestured, and a contingent of Stormland's men marched forward, taking up positions at the entry. They would guard against any last-minute betrayal or hidden Lannister loyalists who might resent their lord's submission. Step by step, the king advanced into Casterly Rock, the old stronghold that had never been forced open in living memory. Within the walls, Robert found neat courtyards carved from ancient stone, massive halls decorated with gold filigree and bright tapestries. Soldiers and servants stood nervously aside, uncertain whether they were witnessing the end of their house's power or the start of a new chapter. Robert paused, letting his gaze wander over the golden lion banners draped from high balconies. Then he turned to Tywin. "You'll quarter my men in your halls, stables, and barns," Robert said. "They'll keep the peace. Any sign of unrest, any attempt to bar them, will be counted as treason." Tywin nodded. "As you wish. I'll see that your needs are met." Stannis and Ned joined the king, each heading small detachments to secure key points within the fortress: armories, storerooms, corridors leading deeper into the rock's tunnels. Tywin's knights were gently but firmly disarmed, at least for the moment. Even so, Robert sensed no immediate danger. Tywin would not invite a massacre inside his own home. Too much was at stake. When at last the immediate tasks were done, setting guards, ensuring no hidden force was waiting to pounce, Robert held a brief council in Casterly Rock's Great Hall. Tywin was present, as was Tyrion, a stoic Kevin Lannister, Ned, Stannis, and other high lords from Robert's host. The hall itself gleamed with polished marble floors and gilded pillars, a testament to Lannister wealth. Now it served as the stage for the final sealing of peace. Tywin, standing tall though ringed by armed foes, formally affirmed that he would pay a vast sum to the crown, the Stormlands, and the Riverlands for the havoc wrought. He would supply a half-dozen valuable hostages, including Kevin and Kevin's eldest sons, to be taken to King's Landing or Dragonstone. He declared, in the hearing of all, that Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were not of Baratheon blood, but the children of Cersei and Jaime Lannister, a vile crime that House Lannister took upon itself as penance. Robert demanded that Tywin swear never to support any claim by those children to the throne, nor would any lion banner be raised in their name. Tywin swore it, though each vow looked as though it cost him a pound of flesh. Then came the matter of Jaime. According to Tywin, Jaime was present at the rock earlier, but upon hearing that Tywin intended to submit, he had vanished, refusing to kneel. Tywin claimed ignorance of his son's whereabouts, suggesting Jaime might have fled by ship or gone into the hills. Robert nearly roared in anger at that. Jaime was the man who had defiled his marriage, fathered bastards that had called themselves Baratheons. Robert wanted to see the Kingslayer brought to justice. Tywin spread his hands. "I cannot control my son's every action. Should he appear, I will ensure he stands before you in chains. If he resists, House Lannister washes its hands of him. He is a knight of the Kingsguard, after all, sworn to you in theory." Robert's fury mounted, but he had little recourse. For now, Jaime was gone. He might emerge later, stirring trouble. But Tywin's willingness to let Jaime be disavowed was another sign of how far the old lion had been forced to bend. Robert clenched his jaw and nodded cold acceptance. He warned that if Jaime were found anywhere in the realm, Robert's men would drag him back to King's Landing, dead or alive. At the end of the council, Tywin asked in a quiet voice if Robert intended to remain at Casterly Rock. Robert shrugged, ignoring the flash of resentment on Tywin's face. "I'll remain as long as I please. I must ensure your compliance. Then I'll return to King's Landing and see that the realm is set in order, once your gold fills my coffers." With that, the harsh business concluded. The king had triumphed, forcing House Lannister to kneel and pay dearly. Yet a sour taste lingered in Robert's mouth, for he knew that Tywin yielded not out of loyalty but necessity. Robert guessed that if the lion ever found a chance to strike back, he would. But for now, the West was subdued. Days passed as the Crown's men took stock of the rock's armories and storerooms, ensuring Tywin was not hiding a secret second army or a great cache of wildfire. Ned Stark conducted himself with quiet diligence, while Stannis glowered at every Lannister retainer as though suspecting a trap. Tywin, for his part, retreated to a smaller set of chambers with Kevin and Tyrion, rarely seen except for official matters. Tension simmered, but no spark lit another round of bloodshed. The gold began to flow, as promised, chests of Lannister coin carried by wagons, bound for the crown's coffers. On a brisk morning a week later, with the surrender formalized, Robert led his men in a final muster outside the gates of the Rock. The time had come to leave a garrison behind, loyal storm lords and river lords to keep watch, and march back to King's Landing. Hostages would travel under heavy guard, included among them Kevan Lannister, who parted from Tywin with stony resolve. As Robert mounted his horse, Tywin stood upon the battlements, unmoving, face carved from ice. Robert could almost taste the old lion's hatred in the wind. He let a triumphant smirk form on his lips. Then he turned and led the column down the coastal road, banners snapping behind him in the sea breeze. Drums beat in steady rhythm, echoing off the cliffs. Peasants lining the path watched in awe and dread, knowing their once invincible overlord had knelt to the king. The march home took weeks, but it was not the brutal slog they had endured before. Lannister loyalists no longer dared attack the king's forces, and the sabotage had ceased. They passed through the riverlands again, where the local lords cheered the king's victory. Near Riverrun, they parted ways with some Tully men, who returned to repair the damage done by war. Ned continued south with Robert, intending to resume his duties as Hand of the King. Stannis rode in grim silence. The captured hostages followed under close guard, setting a careful pace. Some, like young Lancel Lannister, wore expressions of fear or resentment. Others remained stoic. Slowly, the host whittled down as men were granted leave to return to their own lands. Robert carried himself with an air of subdued triumph, physically weary but internally alight with the knowledge that he had bested Tywin Lannister where it truly counted. When they finally neared the gates of King's Landing, horns sounded from the walls. The watchers recognized the king's banners, along with many wagons laden with spoils and gold. Word spread like wildfire through the city that Robert Baratheon had returned victorious. The crowd gathered to watch the columns pass, cheering or jeering as the battered Lannister banners came into view. The Red Keep opened its gates. Renly was there to greet them, looking relieved that his brother had returned alive. Barristan Selmy stood in shining armor, flanked by the gold cloaks who had maintained order during the king's absence. Robert dismounted with a heavy groan, pressing a hand to his side where the old wound still throbbed dully. But he held himself tall, ignoring the ache. Renly bowed low, though he wore a boyish grin. "Welcome home, your grace. The city awaits your triumph." Robert grunted. "Triumph indeed. Where's Cersei?" Renly's grin faded. "Still in her chambers under guard, as you commanded. She's been spirited at times, but she has made no attempt to escape. Joffrey has been kept in a different part of the keep, as have Myrcella and Tommen. None of them have been allowed to see her." "Good." Robert turned to Ned. "See that the Lannister hostages are placed in secure quarters. Double the watch. I don't want them slipping away as Jaime did." Ned nodded and went to relay instructions. Stannis went off to check the city's fortifications, apparently wanting to ensure everything was still in order. Robert, accompanied by Renly and Barristan, strode through the keep's corridors. Servants bowed low. Courtiers peered anxiously from side passages, eager to glimpse the king who had dared to crush the Lannisters. Robert felt their eyes, felt the swirl of rumor and fear. Perhaps some had expected him to die in the West, leaving the throne in question. Yet he lived, and he returned mightier than before. Soon, he arrived at the chamber where Cersei was held. 2 gold cloaks stood guard outside, crossing halberds. At a nod from Robert, they moved aside. The chamber beyond was comfortable, no dank cell. Robert had not wanted the realm to gossip about him throwing a queen into a rat-infested dungeon. Still, it was a prison of sorts, with barred windows and watchers at every door. Cersei sat at a table, wearing a plain gown of deep green, her golden hair unbound. She lifted her eyes when Robert entered, and for a moment, neither spoke. She looked thinner, perhaps from stress or limited rations. Dark circles underlined her green eyes, but she held herself with the same pride. "You've returned," she said, voice taut. Robert stood near the doorway, arms folded across his broad chest. I have. Tywin knelt. The Lannisters are beaten. A flicker of emotion. Anger, disbelief, despair crossed her features, quickly masked. Father knelt? She repeated, as though the words tasted foul. That seems unlikely. Yet it happened, Robert said. And now you, Cersei, stand guilty of treason. Your father begs me to spare your life. Tell me, what do you have to say for yourself? She rose, chin high, yet she could not hide the tremble in her voice. I say you are a brute and a fool, and I despise you. Her tone dripped venom. But if you mean to kill me, do it quickly and be done. I won't crawl. Robert studied her, remembering the young woman she had once been, the illusions he had clung to about a happy marriage. All of that was dust in the wind. Your father has offered me vast gold and sworn loyalty to keep you alive. For the good of the realm, I might accept that arrangement. Perhaps I'll lock you away in a tower for the rest of your days. Perhaps I'll ship you off to a distant land, never to return. Execution might be simpler, but I'll decide in my own time. She gave a bitter laugh. You still want to punish me? Why not let me go? Let me vanish across the narrow sea. You'd never have to see me again, Robert. Robert's eyes darkened. You think I'd set you free to plot vengeance? To cavort with Sel's words or feed the illusions of those bastard children? No, if I let you go, it will be to a place where you cannot harm me or the realm. And rest assured, you will never set foot in King's Landing again. She swallowed, then squared her shoulders. Then do it. Banish me, if that's your pleasure. I'll not beg you for mercy. Robert considered her in stony silence. I'll wait, he said. The time will come soon enough. Until then, you remain here under guard. Perhaps I'll bring the children in to see you, so you can explain to them why they wear no crowns. She bared her teeth. They are mine, not yours, she hissed. You never cared for them. You never cared for anything but your precious battles and your wenches. A pulse of anger shot through him, but he forced it down. He turned and left without another word. Outside, he breathed heavily, the walls closing in on him. Renly looked on anxiously. Baratheon lowered his gaze, uncertain. Robert rubbed a hand across his bearded jaw. Send word to the small council. We convene this evening, he muttered. There's much to discuss. He lumbered away, mind churning. Cersei's fate, Jaime's disappearance, the aftermath of the war, and the question of how best to solidify his rule without plunging the realm into new conflicts. So many burdens pressed on him. But at least he was alive. He had survived the boar's tusk. He had survived the Lannister ambushes. He had brought Tywin to his knees. The realm might yet find peace. He told himself these things, trying to find comfort. That night, the small council gathered in the familiar chamber, lit by dozens of candles. Seated were Ned Stark, Stannis Baratheon, Renly, Pycelle, Peter Baelish, and the newly arrived Kevan Lannister, now a hostage but permitted to observe under guard. Varys still resided in the Red Keep, stepping from the shadows with that soft, cunning smile. Robert took his seat at the head of the table, a fresh bandage binding his ribs. He gazed at each member in turn. I have triumphed over the Lannisters in open war, he declared without preamble, his voice echoing. Tywin has yielded, paying gold and giving hostages. The children, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen, are declared bastards and will never inherit the throne. He paused, letting that hang. Therefore, I name Stannis Baratheon as my heir, to succeed me if I should die without a lawful child of my own body. Henceforth, all the realm shall know that line of succession. A hush fell. Ned nodded in grave agreement. Stannis's face did not visibly change, but a flicker of something, satisfaction, tension, shone in his eyes. Renly lowered his gaze, no smile on his lips. Kevan Lannister looked pained, as if hearing his nephews and niece written off as abominations were salt in an open wound. Now, Robert continued, we must see to the realm's rebuilding. The Riverlands suffered. The Stormlands lost men. We have coin from Tywin's coffers to compensate families, to restore farmland, to bolster OU. our armies so that no one dares test the crown again. I will trust Littlefinger, as master of coin, to ensure the gold is used properly." Baelish inclined his head with a sly grin, no doubt already envisioning ways to line his own purse. Robert paid that little mind for now. Stannis, ever direct, spoke next. "There is also the matter of foreign threats. Word has come that the Targaryen girl, Daenerys, has wedded a Dothraki khal. Some fear she may come seeking the throne eventually." Robert felt a flash of the old hatred for Targaryens. But another part of him was simply weary. How many wars must he fight? "Let her come," he growled. "We'll see how the Dothraki fare against our steel. But if there is a threat, we'll address it. For now, she's half a world away." Varys bowed with a rustle of silken robes. "As master of whisperers, I shall keep my little birds attuned to any Targaryen plots. Rest assured, your grace, you will know of any developments. Though caution is wise. A single slip can—" Robert waved him off. "Yes, caution. Meanwhile, I must see that the lords of Westeros understand the new order. Many houses remain uncertain about the bastard children. They may not question me openly, but they might whisper behind closed doors. I will host a great feast, a celebration of the realm's stability, with lords from every corner invited. Let them witness Stannis crowned as my heir, and let them see the spoils taken from the Lannisters. That will quell any doubt." The council nodded agreement. They spent the next hour discussing the logistics, the distribution of Lannister coin, the rebuilding of war-ravaged roads. Ned insisted they set aside funds for the Riverlands peasants. Baelish tried to protest, but Robert, still in the flush of victory, said it must be done. The realm needed to see that the king took care of the small folk. By the session's end, Robert felt drained but purposeful, a curious mix. He dismissed the council. Ned lingered, as did Stannis. Ned looked at Robert with quiet concern. "What of Cersei?" he asked. "And the children?" Robert exhaled. "The children. I'll have them remain in comfortable custody. They're too young to pay for their mother's sins with their lives. Perhaps when they come of age, I'll send them away somewhere. As for Cersei, her father wants her spared. Perhaps I'll exile her, lock her in a distant holdfast. I'm still deciding. I doubt I'll kill her. That might make her a martyr to any fools who still cling to House Lannister's pride." He gave a humorless laugh. "Tywin would never stop plotting if I cut off his precious daughter's head." Stannis sniffed. "She has committed high treason, as has Jaime Lannister. The law is clear. Yet I see the sense in your reasoning." Ned said nothing, but Robert sensed relief in his eyes. Perhaps Ned still hoped to see some measure of mercy in the realm's governance. Robert found he could not muster the old fury that would demand her death. Once he had wanted her head. Now, after seeing Tywin kneel, he felt he had taken the vengeance that truly mattered. Cersei rotting away in a tower or in an overseas exile might suffice. In the days that followed, King's Landing stirred with new life. Word spread of the victory over the Lannisters, the arrival of hostages, the chests of gold that now filled the Red Keep's vaults. Craftsmen were hired to repair city walls, blacksmiths hammered out new swords and armor, and talk of a grand festival began to swirl. The small folk seemed pleased to know the war had ended swiftly, though they grumbled about higher taxes, which Baelish introduced to offset the crown's existing debts. Robert spent his mornings holding court, receiving lords and knights who came to pledge fealty anew. Some were storm lords returning from war, some were minor houses from the crownlands seeking favor. Each day, Robert sat upon the Iron Throne, ignoring the prickle of the swords beneath him, and listened to the supplicants. He had never much enjoyed such duties, but he endured them better now, keenly aware that his own negligence in the past had allowed Lannister power to grow unchecked. He would not make that mistake again. Then, one afternoon, Joffrey was brought before him. The boy came escorted by 2 gold cloaks, looking sullen and proud as ever. He had not seen Robert in many months, not since the king's harsh arrest of Cersei. Joffrey's golden hair fell around a face twisted by anger, confusion, and fear. He still wore clothes befitting a prince, though with no crown. Robert fixed him with a measured stare. He recalled the child's cruelty, his arrogance, the un-Baratheon look in his features. This was Jaime's son, not his. Yet the small folk still thought of him as the king's heir until recently. It was time to drive the point home. Joffrey glared, voice trembling. "Have you come to gloat? You locked my mother away. You took my birthright. Your birthright never existed," Robert said in a low, cutting tone. "You are not my son. Jaime Lannister sired you." A flicker of real fear darkened Joffrey's eyes. "That's a lie. I'm a prince. My mother said." "Your mother said many lies," Robert snarled. "You are no prince of mine, nor are Myrcella or Tommen. The realm knows it now. House Lannister itself has admitted it. Your grandsire knelt before me. There is no place for you at this court. You will not inherit the throne." Joffrey's face tightened, tears of rage gathering at the corners of his eyes. Still, he refused to weep openly. "I hate you," he spat. Robert felt a pang of bitterness. It would be easy to lash out physically to cuff the boy across the ear, but he stayed his hand. "You may hate me if you wish, but it changes nothing. You will remain in comfortable confinement for now. Perhaps in time, if you learn humility, you'll be sent somewhere far from here. But you will never call yourself Baratheon again." The boy tried to lunge forward, as if to claw Robert's face, but the gold cloaks pulled him back. He shrieked incoherent threats, calling Robert a usurper. The king only watched, stone-faced, until Joffrey's voice turned to sobs of fury. Then Robert signaled for the guards to remove him. Once they dragged the boy away, a hush settled in the throne room. Robert could feel the eyes of courtiers on him. Some pitied the boy, some hated him, some feared the king for speaking so harshly. But Robert did not waver. Better to sever any illusions now than let the realm drift into confusion again. He felt oddly hollow after the confrontation, but also resolute. That evening, he dined with Ned and Renly in a private solar. They ate roasted duck, drank mild wine, and spoke of the next steps in governance. Ned recommended making peace overtures to House Tyrell, ensuring the Reach remained loyal. Renly proposed hosting a grand tournament along with the feast to celebrate the victory. Robert was lukewarm on the idea of a lavish tournament. His side still bore the scars of war, but he saw how it might placate restless nights. He finally agreed, provided it was modest enough not to drain the treasury. Over the next fortnight, preparations for the festival and tournament began in earnest. Lords and ladies from near and far arrived, offering belated congratulations or pledging loyalty anew. The air in King's Landing sparkled with excitement, and not a little tension, for rumor had it that the king's mood could be dark if crossed. The gold cloaks maintained strict order, remembering the war's fresh wounds. Robert made time to visit the Street of Steel and the city's taverns in discreet fashion, accompanied by a small retinue. He found a grim satisfaction in walking among the common folk, letting them see their king with his war scars. Some still remembered him from his younger days, the charismatic rebel who had overthrown the Mad King. Now, older and battered, Robert sensed a flicker of that old admiration in their cheers when they recognized him. One day, while passing through Flea Bottom, Robert saw a smithy's apprentice with a head of thick black hair. He paused, recognizing the lad, Gendry, one of his known bastards. The boy looked at him with wide eyes, seeing the crowned man who wore the same dark curls and powerful frame. Robert felt a pang of something, regret or paternal instinct, and tossed the lad a coin, telling him to keep forging well. Then he moved on, disturbed by how easily he recognized the Baratheon stamp in the boy's features. The memory of Joffrey's golden hair stung all over again. Soon enough, the day of the grand feast arrived. The Red Keep bustled with lords from across the realm. Even a few Westerland houses came, though Tywin Lannister was conspicuously absent, still brooding in Casterly Rock. Kevan Lannister was kept under guard, but allowed to appear in the hall as part of his good behavior arrangement, a visible sign that House Lannister was on a short leash. The hall shone with banners. The crowned stag of Baratheon, the dire wolf of Stark, the dragonstone stag of Stannis, the flower of Tyrell for those who made the journey from the Reach, and the trout of Tully. The Lion of Lannister was nowhere to be seen. Robert sat at the high table, with Ned on one side and Stannis on the other. Renly presided over the dais below, welcoming guests with bright smiles. Courses of lavish food paraded through. Capons and honey, peppered boar, fresh fruits from the Reach, sweet wines from the arbor. Jugglers and minstrels performed. The hall roared with toasts to the king. When the feast was halfway done, Robert stood, raising his goblet. The revelers quieted. Candlelight danced on the polished steel of the guards. Robert's voice, deep and resonant, carried through the hall. "My lords and ladies, we are gathered here to mark the realm's unity after a time of strife. War has ended quickly, thanks to the valor of many brave men. The traitors who sought to undermine the crown have been brought low, and my house stands unbroken." He paused, letting the applause wash over him. "Henceforth, let all the 7 kingdoms know, I have no true-born children, nor will I recognize the bastards born of my former queen. House Baratheon's line shall continue through my brother, Stannis, named as my heir. May the realm prosper under the might of our combined lords." A fresh wave of cheering erupted, though some present clapped with less enthusiasm. Robert drained his goblet. The wine tasted sweeter than usual, perhaps because it was not drowning sorrow but celebrating victory. He lowered the cup and let the crowd resume its merriment. Thus ended the question of the succession for the moment. Robert returned to his seat, feeling Ned's approving nod and Stannis's stiff acceptance. A part of Robert's soul still ached, remembering how he had once dreamed of sons. But the illusions had crumbled alongside his marriage, and now he moved forward with something more solid. A realm he controlled, a line of succession that would not be overshadowed by golden-haired bastards. For the next few days, the tournament flickered across the fields outside King's Landing, drawing knights from near and far. Robert walked among the pavilions with Ned, occasionally cheering a joust. He had always loved a good melee, but the old wound pained him enough that he refrained from competing. Instead, he was content to watch from the stands, sometimes shaking his head at the posturing of younger knights. The crowd roared whenever a favored champion unhorsed an opponent. It was a spectacle of color and adrenaline, a reminder of the realm's appetite for heroic sport. Then, on the tournament's final day, a surprise challenger arrived wearing armor of plain steel, the visor down. He bore no crest, rode a dappled gray stallion, and entered the lists without fanfare. The heralds announced him simply as a mystery knight. Robert leaned forward in his seat. Such masked arrivals were not unheard of, but they usually had some hidden purpose. As the tilts commenced, the mystery knight knocked down seasoned competitors with alarming ease. Some whispered it might be Barristan Selmy in disguise, or some famed hedge knight seeking a moment of glory. Blow after blow, the gray stallion thundered, the lance striking true. The crowd began to chant for him, enthralled by the spectacle. Robert watched, his curiosity piqued. He glanced at Ned. "Any guess who that might be?" Ned shook his head. "No rumor reached me about such a knight." When the final tilt came, the mystery knight faced a Tyrell bannerman in bright green armor. The stands held their breath. In a burst of speed, the 2 knights charged, lances level. The Tyrell bannerman struck the mystery knight's shield, but the blow glanced off. The mystery knight's lance caught him square in the breastplate, unhorsing him with a thunderous impact. Cheers erupted. The unknown warrior had claimed victory. The victor rode to the royal box, lowering the lance in salute. Robert stood, raising a hand for silence. The crowd hushed, eager to see this knight's identity revealed. Robert's eyes narrowed. "Remove your helm," he commanded. Slowly, the knight complied, gauntlet hands lifting the visor. Beneath was the face of Jaime Lannister, his golden hair matted with sweat, green eyes gleaming with defiance. A collective gasp rippled through the stands. Guards tensed, uncertain. Jaime sat astride his horse, battered shield on one arm, the painted device of a crowned stag marred by scuffs. "Jaime Lannister," Robert growled, his grip on the railing tightening. The man he had sought for so long had revealed himself in the heart of the king's own tournament. Bold or mad? You dare show your face here? Jaime lifted his chin. I come seeking trial by combat, your grace, to prove my innocence of treason, to show I'm worthy to serve in the Kingsguard. I have bested all challengers this day. Tension rose. The gold cloaks started forward, but Robert held up a hand. The hush was suffocating. Jaime Lannister, father of Cersei's bastards, Kingslayer, fugitive, had brazenly entered the lists and emerged triumphant. Sweat trickled down Robert's temple. In the stands, the crowd murmured, uncertain whether to cheer the champion or call for his arrest. You are guilty of adultery with the queen, Robert said, voice echoing in the summer air. You broke your vows as a Kingsguard, fathered bastards in the royal line, and conspired to kill me. Jaime's lips curved in a mocking half-smile. Conspired to kill you? I was never part of that. I'll not deny bedding my sister, but if you want to punish me for that, try me under the laws of the Seven. I demand a trial by combat, here and now. Robert's fury contended with the sense of spectacle. The entire realm was watching this. If he simply ordered Jaime cut down, some might whisper about the king denying him rightful justice. Trial by combat was a holy rite, recognized across the Seven Kingdoms. Even if it was an archaic or manipulated tradition, many believed the gods decided such trials. Ned, at Robert's side, leaned in and murmured, Your Grace, do not let him manipulate you. He's a cunning man. He must have planned this display to sway the crowd, make himself appear honorable. Stannis, standing behind them, seethed. Let me face him. I'll put an end to this farce. Robert paused, scanning the crowd. Knights looked on with conflicted expressions. Some had admired Jaime's skill on the field for years. The small folk clamored in confusion. He realized if Jaime was summarily seized and executed, it might cast doubt on the king's sense of justice in the public's eye. But a trial by combat was a risk. Jaime was formidable, a deadly swordsman. If Robert or his champion lost, the gods' verdict would suggest Jaime was innocent, a notion that enraged him. Yet to refuse outright was to appear fearful or tyrannical. Gritting his teeth, Robert forced calm. You want a trial by combat, Kingslayer? So be it. You shall face my champion. He looked around. Stannis had already volunteered, but Robert saw Barristan Selmy stepping forward from the sidelines, a stoic determination on his face. Barristan bowed, hand on the hilt of his sword. Your Grace, I will stand for you. Jaime Lannister has broken every vow of the Kingsguard. Let me remedy that disgrace. Jaime's eyes flicked to Barristan, a flash of respect. The bold Ser Barristan. I'd expect no less. The crowd roared at the prospect of a duel between two of the realm's greatest knights. Robert declared it would happen the next day, on the same jousting field at midday. Jaime was disarmed by the gold cloaks and taken under guard to a secure chamber. Tension crackled in the city. People spoke of nothing else. Jaime Lannister, who had bested the entire tourney in secret, now facing Ser Barristan Selmy in a trial by combat. Even Ned could not hide his worry, for Jaime was in his prime, while Barristan was older, though still formidable. Robert's gut churned with dread and anger, but he had given his word. The next day dawned bright and hot. The stands overflowed with onlookers. Robert presided from a dais, flanked by Ned and Stannis, while a ring of armed men stood watch. Jaime entered the field first, wearing plate and mail of Lannister steel, expression set in grim focus. Barristan followed, donning plain white plate that denoted his station as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. The hush was almost reverent as the two knights bowed to the king, then to each other. A herald stepped forward, reciting the formal accusations against Jaime Lannister. Treason, adultery, oath-breaking. Jaime claimed his innocence of treason, acknowledging only the sin of incest, which he argued did not warrant execution under law unless proven to endanger the king. The herald concluded with, "Let the gods decide." On Robert's signal, the two knights drew steel. A hush fell like a physical weight, every spectator leaning forward. Jaime lunged first, with the swiftness of a born swordsman. Barristan parried, the ring of metal sharp as lightning. They circled, testing each other. Jaime attacked with a flurry of blows, forcing Barristan to give ground. The old knight's face was calm, but Robert could see the effort. Barristan was still fast, though age had stolen a fraction of his speed. Jaime pressed relentlessly, trying to unbalance him. Steel clashed in a brilliant display of skill. At one point, Jaime slipped a thrust past Barristan's guard, grazing the older knight's shoulder. A hiss went through the crowd. Barristan countered with a downward slash that rang against Jaime's pauldron, staggering him. Dust kicked up around their feet as they circled again. Robert's knuckles whitened on the railing. He remembered that Barristan Selmy had once faced fierce odds in tournaments and real battles alike, while Jaime had achieved knighthood at a young age and was rumored to be the best sword in the realm. It was an even match, each man reading the other's movements. Sweat gleamed on their brows. The sun rose high, intensifying the heat. A savage exchange followed. Jaime locked blades with Barristan in a clinch, their swords scraping. Jaime shoved forward, and Barristan stumbled. It seemed the younger knight had the advantage, but the old knight recovered with a pivot that brought his blade cutting across Jaime's midsection. Sparks flew from the breastplate. Jaime twisted aside, but lost his footing for a heartbeat. Barristan lunged, aiming for a decisive blow, yet Jaime wrenched his sword around and parried in the nick of time. The crowd roared, half in fear, half in excitement. They broke apart, each breathing heavily. Barristan's white cloak was stained with dirt and a bit of blood from his shoulder wound. Jaime's golden hair clung to the sweat on his temples. Both men wore expressions of fierce concentration. For a moment, they paused, each measuring the other's fatigue. Then Jaime charged again, sword flashing in a deadly arc. Barristan blocked high, pivoted, tried for a slash at Jaime's legs, but Jaime leapt back with uncanny grace. A roar of frustration escaped Barristan's lips, and Jaime pressed the advantage, raining blows from left and right. The older knight's defense began to waver. Robert rose halfway from his seat, fear seizing him. If Barristan fell, the god's judgment would free Jaime, or so the trial by combat tradition implied, and the realm would be thrown into chaos. But Barristan Selmy was not called Barristan the Bold for nothing. Summoning a last well of strength, he pivoted inside Jaime's swing, meeting the blade with a parry that slid Jaime's sword wide. The younger knight overextended for a moment. Barristan seized the opening, driving his pommel into Jaime's side. Jaime gasped, stumbling. In that heartbeat, Barristan hammered his sword down onto Jaime's wrist, disarming him. The sword flew from Jaime's grip, skidding across the dirt. A collective gasp swept the stands. Jaime, kneeling, tried to scramble for his blade, but Barristan placed the tip of his sword at Jaime's throat before he could move another inch. Dust hung in the air, sweat dripping from Barristan's brow as he gazed down with finality. Jaime looked up, defiance mingled with something like resignation. "Yield," Barristan growled. Jaime's chest heaved. After a long moment, he gave a tight nod. "I yield." A thunderous cheer erupted. Barristan stepped back, sword still held ready. Jaime sank to one knee fully, hands raised in defeat. Robert exhaled in profound relief. He turned to the herald and signaled. The herald declared, "The gods have spoken. Ser Jaime Lannister is found guilty of the crimes for which he stands accused." Guards rushed in, seizing Jaime's arms, preventing any last-second treachery. Jaime offered no resistance, his eyes locked on Robert's as if daring him to pass a final sentence. Robert's emotions churned. Triumph, anger, a twinge of grim respect for Jaime's skill. He rose from his seat, stepping to the edge of the stands. "You demanded trial by combat. The verdict is clear," Robert said. "You are guilty." Jaime stared up, sweat-soaked hair hanging in his face. "Then pass your sentence. I ask for a clean death, at least." Robert let the hush build. A part of him wanted to kill Jaime on the spot, to repay him for the years of deceit, for fathering those children. But as he looked over the sea of faces, lords, knights, small folk. He realized what an execution would mean. He remembered the vow of peace he had demanded from Tywin. Killing Jaime would inflame the old lion again, though Tywin had disavowed him. Another part of Robert recognized that a quick death might be too great a mercy. "Take him to the black cells," Robert pronounced. "He can rot there, alongside his sister, until I decide their ultimate fate." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some wanted blood. Others were relieved to avoid more war. Jaime sagged in the guard's grip. Baratheon lowered his sword, wincing at his shoulder wound but standing tall. Robert signaled for the session to end, and the trial by combat concluded with victory for the crown. Thus ended Jaime's last gambit to clear his name. He would live, at least for now, imprisoned in King's Landing's darkest depths. Cersei would remain under guard, uncertain of her end. Tywin Lannister, forced to kneel, could do little but fume from afar. The illusions of the false Baratheon heirs lay shattered, and Stannis' claim was enshrined. In the weeks after, Robert felt an odd emptiness in the wake of so much violence and upheaval. He had won, yet at times he wondered what he had truly gained beyond a battered realm and a host of vengeful foes. Still, the Iron Throne was his without question now. The realm settled into a wary peace, with only murmurs of far-off Targaryen threats or possible Dothraki raids coloring the edges of rumor. In King's Landing, life returned to a semblance of normal. Robert Baratheon would rule on, no longer the complacent, drunken king of old, but a hardened monarch who had confronted the serpents in his bedchamber and lived to tell the tale. He had survived the boar's tusk, thwarted the Lannisters' ambitions, and brought Tywin to heel. The price had been high, but in the grand, brutal tapestry of Westeros, victory seldom came cheap. He stood one evening on a balcony overlooking the Blackwater Bay, the sunset staining the sky in fiery reds. His bandaged side still ached, but he endured it. Ned joined him quietly, and they gazed at the ships below. Neither spoke for a time, content in a moment of calm after the storms they had weathered. At last, Ned said, "The realm stands because you acted swiftly." Robert grunted. "Perhaps, or perhaps it stands on the edge of another war. The Lannisters will nurse their grudges. The Targaryen girl might come with a horde of savages. The Greyjoys might rise again. There's always another threat, Ned." Ned inclined his head. "Always, but you are the king, and you have shown the realm what you will do to keep your power secure." Robert let the wind ruffle his thick black hair. He said quietly, voice tinged with regret. "And God's help me, I'll do it again if I must." They stood in silence as the sun sank below the horizon, the water shining like bronze in the dying light. Whatever the future might bring, be it fresh wars, more betrayals, or the specter of dragons reborn, Robert Baratheon would face it on his feet, hammer in hand, determined not to let a pig's tusk or a lion's claw unmake him. He had proved, beyond doubt, that he was still the Storm Lord, and for a time at least the Seven Kingdoms bent to his will.